Chapter 152. Outside the window, the sound of the rain had basically stopped, and the clouds were dyed red by the setting sun. Roland pushed open the door of the guest room on the first floor, and saw Marjorie walking back and forth in front of the fireplace, looking quite uneasy. When the bodyguard Sean saw the prince, he raised his hand to salute and left, but she quickly came forward and eagerly asked, "Your Royal Highness, how is Lightning?" Roland was startled. He had imagined all kinds of reactions from the other side, from calm to anger to indifference, but he did not expect that her first words would be this. "She's fine, just tired." "Really? That's good." She looked relieved. "You seem to care about her very much." "She looks very much like her father, especially her narrow eyes and pointed nose. I can see that she is Thunder's daughter." Then she sighed, unbuttoned her neckline, lowered her head, and took off a string of golden ornaments hanging around her neck. "You said before to verify, you mean to use a witch's ability to judge, right? If this can prove my sincerity, can you let her join in the conversation? I don't like the feeling of being secretly peeped at." The ornaments were made up of a string of gold chains and a huge light blue gem. The gem, which was cut into a hexahedron, should be a high-quality god's stone of retaliation. Roland was thinking about how to open his mouth to reduce the other side's disgust and doubts, but he did not expect that she would take the initiative to do so. To be honest, he somewhat admired this Fjord's woman. Even though she was in an extremely unfavorable situation, she still tried to take the initiative in the conversation. Whether it was her negotiation skills or her demeanor, she was in line with the identity of a successful businesswoman. He took the god's stone of retaliation from the other side and hung it on the fireplace's hanger. This quality of the god's stone of retaliation was estimated to have a range of about 1 meter, and in Nightingale's eyes, it was comparable to a huge black hole. Perhaps in order to avoid the effect of the stone, she had already hidden far away. "Let's go to the reception room and talk," Roland said. Since the other side had shown her sincerity, he should not be too stingy. When the two of them entered the drawing room, Nightingale had already revealed herself and was sitting at the head of the table. She rested her chin on her hands and deliberately acted as if she had been waiting for a long time. It seemed that she was thinking the same thing as him, the prince thought. After sitting down, he took the initiative to introduce, "This woman is Nightingale. She can judge whether you are speaking the truth or not." "Hello, Miss Nightingale." Marjorie nodded at her, and the latter returned the gesture. "You said before that you have no malice towards witches, why?" Roland's first question was also the one he wanted to know the answer to the most. "As far as I know, there are also church forces in the fjords. But its influence is far less than that of the three gods. In other words, most of the fjord's people worship the sky, the sea, and the earth like the Sand Nation. As for me..." She paused. "I had a very good companion. On one of our fishing trips, we were caught in a storm, and our sailboat was broken by a huge wave. She had become a witch in this disaster and could breathe like a fish. She found me while I was unconscious and dragged me ashore." "What happened after that?" Nightingale asked curiously. "After I woke up, she left. Perhaps she was more eager to be in the sea than to be with me," Marjorie said regretfully. "After that, I never saw her again. The people in the village often said that she would appear when the sea was covered in fog, and use her singing to guide the fishing boats away from the reef. In any case, my companion could not be evil, let alone the devil's minions." Roland nodded. Witches were awakened from ordinary people. If they had a deep contact or understanding with them before their awakening, it would be difficult to change the impression formed by the Church's unilateral words. "You seem to have a good understanding of witches' abilities. With just a few words, you guessed that I might have more than one witch hidden here." "To be honest, because of my childhood companion, I was very interested in witches, and had thought of taking in this group of strange women." Marjorie smiled. "Unfortunately, King's City is not like Border Town, and finally because the risk was too great, I gave up. Lightning's actions seemed to be very close to you, plus her identity as a witch. So I thought maybe you, like me, don't hate witches. As a lord, it was not difficult for him to hide several witches, especially in the borderlands. But you still have to be very careful. If they are discovered by the church, it will be very difficult for you to protect them. At this point, Nightingale still did not find any signs of Roland lying, which basically ruled out the possibility of her informing the church. Roland finally felt relieved, and said with a slight apology, "It seems that I really am overthinking. I hope you don't take it to heart." "No, Your Highness, this action is also for the safety of Lightning and, this woman," Marjorie waved her hand. "If you were indifferent, it would be irresponsible of you." "Are you familiar with thunder?" Roland asked. Your love for lightning is really more than the kind of care ordinary people have for the children of heroes. Faced with this question, Marjorie hesitated for a moment. Roland indicated that if she did not want to answer, she could pretend that she had not asked, but she finally slowly said, "To tell you the truth, after I left the fishing village, I joined Lord Thunder's expedition team, and experienced a long period of exploration with him. As a newcomer, Lord Thunder and his wife took special care of me, and on the day that Lightning was born, I was also present." "She was born on the ship?" "Yes, in a violent storm. Outside the cabin, Lightning and Thunder never stopped. Shortly after she was born, Lord Thunder's wife died because of sepsis, and I became her half-mother. Without breast milk, I mixed chewed wheat porridge and caviar together and fed her little by little." Marjorie's voice became very gentle. Although Lord Thunder was extremely sad, he still had to command the fleet to move forward. Without the backbone, the crew could easily collapse after several months of sailing. "And I stayed in the cabin, watching Lightning grow up slowly. It was not until Lord Thunder found the Shadow Islands and successfully returned to the Sea Dragon Bay that the expedition ended. Later, I left the fjords and settled down in Greycastle King's City." "I see." Roland sighed in his heart. It was no wonder that she had such a strong reaction when she heard the name of Thunder. As for why she did not continue to follow Thunder on the expedition, he could roughly guess a thing or two. With the beginning of a love story, it might not be possible to reap the ending of the love story. This was really a coincidence. Since there was this layer of relationship, would he be able to get a greater discount when doing business? He coughed twice. "Ms. Marjorie, in this way, we can be considered acquaintances. What about the deal?" Chapter 153. Kyle Sichi walked into the alchemy workshop. Chief Mentor, the apprentices bowed their heads in greeting when they saw Kyle. He waved his hand. "You continue." The apprentices squatted down again and busied themselves with their work. The outermost part of the workshop was the cleaning room, where materials from all over Greycastle were cleaned, sorted, screened, and ground. The design of the cleaning room was also very ingenious. The stone floor was laid over a stream, and the middle was used for passage. On both sides were streams flowing parallel to the stone path. After crossing an arm's width of the stream, the outermost part was the cleaning area. At first glance, the long and narrow cleaning room looked like it was divided into 3 parts by 2 streams. Light shone through the holes in the windows on both sides of the wall and reflected on the stone floor and the stream, forming long light spots across the room. Light and darkness overlapped each other, like the stripes of a snake. Nearly 100 apprentices were leaning against the wall, processing the materials assigned to them. If the sundries were lighter than water, they could be directly thrown into the stream. If they were heavier than water, they had to put them in baskets and take them out of the cleaning room before discarding them. Using running water for cleaning was much more effective than using stagnant water in a wooden bucket. They would study here for 3 to 5 years until they were familiar with the sorting and cleaning of various materials. Only then would they have the opportunity to be selected as apprentices by the mentor and move to the next room. Kyle stepped on the alternating light spots and walked into the refining room in the core area of the alchemy workshop. When he opened the door, his line of sight suddenly became clear. 12 giant wooden pillars transported from the concealing forest supported this extremely spacious room. There were windows on all 4 sides of the stone walls, and even the roof was equipped with a patio and shelter, making the room extremely bright. There were 6 wide wooden tables in the center of the refining room, on which a variety of alchemy tools were piled: round-bottomed bottles, glasses, scales, mortars, stoves, crucibles. Each mentor was responsible for managing and using a table, and as the chief alchemist of Redwater City, he naturally used the longest table with the most tools. This place was always full of chaos and disorder, just like alchemy, mixing all kinds of materials together, heating, dry distillation, boiling, and burning. The results were always ever-changing and fascinating. If he could find a clear direction from these chaotic changes and write it down, it would be an extremely rare alchemy formula. Those who could create their own alchemy formulas could be called alchemists. So far, he had summed up more than 10 alchemy formulas, each of which seemed to have come from the whispers of God. Kyle believed that once alchemy was developed to a certain extent, not only would it be possible to separate the origin, but it would also be possible to combine all things. "Chavez, how is your imitation of the snow powder?" he asked. A young man in his 20s walked over and shook his head. "Those damned alchemists of the Imperial City must have added some other raw materials to it. The powder is very finely ground, and I really can't separate anything useful from it." He was the youngest alchemist in the alchemy workshop. Generally speaking, it was impossible to create an alchemy formula without a long time of accumulation and trial and error. Sometimes, it even required a little bit of luck. Many of the people in the workshop had been disciples for their entire lives, but even in death, they could not improve further. However, Chavez had an extraordinary talent for alchemy. 2 years ago, he summarized the method of distilling green vitriol to obtain acid, which won the unanimous approval of the 5 alchemists. Since then, a long table had been added to the refining room. "Don't worry, take your time." He smiled and patted the other side's shoulder to comfort him. Having been the chief alchemist for 8 years, Kyle naturally understood the difficulty of finding the truth from disorder and chaos. "But last night, I came up with a good thing that can teach those arrogant guys a lesson. Come with me." He went to his table and asked 2 disciples to bring a storage box. The box was about half the height of a person, and its whole body was made of wrought iron, making it difficult to steal, and also difficult to destroy. He took out a key and opened the lattice of the first layer. In the center of the lattice lay a small piece of transparent crystal. A cut crystal. Chavez, who was standing to the side, carefully held it in his hand and looked at the sunlight outside the window. "No, this is crystal glass." "My God. You did it." "Yes," Kyle said with a proud smile. "I really want to see, when those guys see that their proudest alchemy product has been successfully copied by me, what kind of wonderful expression will they have on their faces." Chavez couldn't help but exclaim in admiration, which alarmed the other alchemists. They put down their work and surrounded him. "Is this the result of staying up until midnight last night? It's really great. It's really beautiful, it's like a crystal. Congratulations, with this, the position of our alchemy workshop in the Duke's heart will greatly rise. How did you make it? Can you tell me?" Kyle nodded. "We all know that the composition of glass and river sand is very similar. The reason why the color of glass produced by river sand is different is because they contain impurities. Either we find a way to remove the impurities, or we find a way to get a purer sand. Everyone is trying in this direction, and I am also doing the same. The success of this alchemy is largely due to an accident. I chose the fine white sand from Willow Town and the sandstone from Fallen Dragon Ridge." The crowd gathered around him and listened quietly. When he finished, the alchemists all breathed a sigh of relief. "So that's how it is, you are really very thoughtful." Crystal was a rare and expensive gemstone, and a colorless transparent crystal was even rarer. Only the cleanest and brightest glass could be called crystal glass. Relying on this product, the alchemy workshop of the King's City had steadily surpassed the alchemy workshop of Redwater City. The amount of gold royals they earned every year made the Duke of Redwater City envious. But now, this situation would soon change. If Chavez could figure out the composition of the snow powder, coupled with the double stone acid method, they would completely surpass the King's City alchemy workshop. At that time, those guys who only knew how to look down on others would have no choice but to lower their cock-like heads. Thinking of this, Kyle Sichi's mood became even more cheerful. Just as he was about to sift through the second batch of raw materials for the crystal glass, a disciple hurriedly came to his side. "Chief Mentor, there is a messenger from border town of the western region who wants to see you. He has brought a letter from the fourth prince, Roland Wimbledon." The fourth prince? Kyle frowned and thought for a moment. It seemed that there was indeed such a person in the Greycastle royal family. He knew very little about the affairs of the aristocracy. In his impression, this group of people were ignorant, only fighting for power and wealth. "What does he want from me?" "I don't know." The messenger said that as long as you read the letter, you will naturally understand His Highness' meaning. The chief alchemist showed an extremely impatient look. The content of the letter was presumably either to recruit him with a large sum of money, or to denounce alchemy as a demon's trick. But since the other party was a prince, he still had to maintain basic etiquette. "Take me to see him, and when I get the letter, I will make him leave." Chapter 154. When Kyle Sichi returned home, it was already completely dark. After dinner, accompanied by his family, he returned to his study and wrote the raw material formula and material selection experience of crystal glass into his book, The Door to Alchemy, which recorded his journey from an apprentice to a chief alchemist. It also included all the alchemy formulas summarized by the Redwater City Alchemy Workshop over the years. Kyle believed that with this book, he would be able to leave his name in history. Even after thousands of years, those alchemists would still deeply remember his name. Kyle put down the quill pen and prepared to take off his clothes and sleep until the candle flame was close to the base. Suddenly, he remembered that there was still a letter from the prince that he hadn't opened. Glancing at the candle that was only as long as a fingernail, he decided to use the last bit of time to finish reading the letter. Tomorrow, he would verbally reply to the messenger. The small half of the candle tail was only enough for him to write a few dozen words, but it was enough to read a worthless letter. He opened the envelope and found a total of 3 thin sheets of paper. The first page was a common greeting, introducing his title and territory. Kyle didn't even bother to read it and directly jumped to the second page. The content of the second page slightly surprised him. It was neither recruitment nor reprimand, but 5 strange formulas. If he looked carefully, he would find that each formula was composed of 3 sentences. "Ah, a little interesting." He smiled. Regardless of the prince's purpose, at least he was deliberately mystifying. He glanced at the first line. Nitric acid is produced by dry distillation of saltpeter. Nitric acid, dry distillation, these are all alchemy terms. Wait, Kyle was suddenly startled. Isn't this one of the double stone acid production methods in the alchemy workshop? The acid produced by dry distillation of saltpeter must be collected through a special container. It looks no different from ordinary water vapor and is very difficult to attract attention. But it is very corrosive. Not only can it burn skin, but it can even dissolve some metals. This is actually an alchemy formula. Is it possible that Border Town also has an alchemist? He quickly moved his line of sight to the next line. If the first sentence had shocked him, then the second sentence was inconceivable. It was composed of a bunch of inexplicable symbols. The symbols were juxtaposed together to form 2 equations. Kyle frowned, he had never seen such a strange symbol before. Further down, the third sentence seemed to be an explanation of the second sentence, including the names and meanings of the symbols. To be honest, he still couldn't figure it out after reading it. Those awkward words seemed to be some coined words. He needed to read it many times before he could associate the words with the symbols. Even so, the meaning of the whole sentence still baffled him. Just then, the flame of the candle flickered and went out. Damn it! Kyle cursed in his heart, and without the slightest hesitation, he took a candle from the drawer and lit it again. When the second candle was halfway burned, the chief alchemist's hand that was holding the letter was trembling slightly. The letter didn't seem to have any content, but it took several times more time than usual to read. The 5 elements on the second page were actually all alchemy formulas. It wouldn't have been a big deal if that was all. An outstanding master alchemist using his own power to summarize 5 formulas wasn't something unimaginable, but these 5 formulas, with the exception of the acid-making method, all echoed with each other. Some coined words appeared over and over again, forming a seemingly balanced cycle. Nitric acid reacts with silver to produce silver nitrate, water, and nitric oxide. Silver nitrate reacts with iron to produce ferrous nitrate and silver. Silver nitrate reacts with copper to produce copper nitrate and silver. Copper nitrate reacts with iron to produce ferrous nitrate and copper. He had also done the alchemical reaction of putting silver rods in acid. Some of the silver rods were clearly dissolved by the acid and disappeared. This was the characteristic of acid, which was to corrode everything. But Xian Shang swore that because silver nitrate was dissolved in water, it seemed to disappear on the surface, but in fact, the silver only existed in another form and wasn't annihilated. How is this possible? No. Kyle shook his head. Apparently, the other party had also guessed his thoughts. These formulas echoing with each other wasn't a coincidence. He realized that the other party was giving him an opportunity to verify. Whether it was silver, iron, or copper, they were all common minerals. If alchemy was carried out according to the following formulas, the silver could be replaced again to prove that it wasn't annihilated, but still existed in the acid. Looking at the neatly arranged formulas on the paper, he felt that it was difficult to breathe. If these alchemy formulas were true, then his years of accumulated experience, the efforts of his peers, and the writing of The Gate of Alchemy would all be nothing but a joke. You sleep with the child first, I'm going to the alchemy workshop. Ignoring his wife's surprised gaze, Kyle put on his coat and rushed straight into the night. When he arrived at the alchemy workshop, he immediately called 3 disciples on duty and told them that he was going to conduct an alchemy experiment. He asked them to light torches and candles, the more the better. The order was quickly executed, and his long table was illuminated by the fire. The disciples shuttled between the material room and the refining room, preparing the test materials for the chief alchemist. There was still a lot of acid left from the dry distillation of saltpeter, so the verification could start directly from the second line of the formula. He took out some acid and poured it into a glass, then put the silver rod in. As the reaction began, the rod gradually corroded, accompanied by bubbles. While waiting anxiously, Kyle opened the 3rd page of the letter. There was only a short sentence on it. I just did a little bit of work. If you want to know more answers, come to Border Town. Damn it, this sentence was the same as not writing. If he could really verify what was written on the letter, no matter what, he had to go see this unknown master alchemist. Otherwise, he would be unable to eat or sleep well in the future. Until the bubbles stopped coming out, he took out the broken silver rod and put a small piece of copper into the glass. Something incredible happened. The surface of the copper quickly became a little white, like the carapace of a ladybug. The white spots became bigger and bigger, slowly covering the whole copper, and the acid in the glass also changed from colorless to blue. It was exactly the same as described in the letter. The white precipitate was silver, and the newly formed substance, copper nitrate, was also soluble in water like silver nitrate, but its solution was blue. Kyle Sichi stared blankly at the result in his cup. The next morning, when Chavez arrived at the alchemy workshop, he was startled by the haggard chief alchemist who had dark circles under his eyes. "Didn't you sleep last night?" He was greatly surprised, for the second batch of crystal glass. Kyle shook his head, pulled Chavez to the long table, and asked tiredly, "You were my most proud disciple. I want to ask, what do you think about alchemy?" Just like what you taught me." He noticed that there were some glasses on the table, several of which were filled with different colored solutions, one of which was sky blue, very eye-catching. "Is this the reason why the chief alchemist didn't sleep last night?" Although Chavez was full of confusion, he still honestly replied, "I also feel the same way. The essence of alchemy is to find the truth of the world in disorder and chaos." "No, no, no, Chavez, I was wrong," Kyle interrupted. "Everyone is wrong. Alchemy is not like this." "Not like this." Chavez felt that the other side was a bit strange. First, he was alchemy all night long, and now he was asking some inexplicable questions. But before he could ask further, the chief alchemist had already said, "Alchemy is more orderly than you and I can imagine. It can even be said to be rigid, just like 1 + 1 = 2, no matter how it changes, the substance will not increase or disappear." "Will not increase or disappear? What are you talking about? Isn't it common for alchemists to sift and combine some common raw materials to produce incredible new things?" He was puzzled. Chapter 155. Roland received the first purchase order for the steam engine, and the transaction amount was the largest so far. The price of a bare machine was 500 golden dragon. 2 units were delivered in the first month, and then 1 more every month, for a total of 10 units. In the future, technical support, parts replacement, and equipment improvement of the steam engine would require additional golden dragon payments. As for the quality after-sales service and the promise of 3 guarantees, Roland said he had never heard of them. Barav was the most excited about this deal. In his opinion, anything that could increase the income of the city hall, whether it was trade or plunder, was worthy of praise. Carter, Scroll, and Nightingale had all raised doubts about this matter. They believed that it was still too early to sell these powerful machines to outsiders. Currently, Border Town didn't even have enough of them to use. Roland didn't explain too much about this, because he didn't just consider it from the perspective of a lord, but from the position of an industrialized promoter. It was almost impossible to promote the process of social industrialization with one's own strength, even if he had knowledge ahead of the times. The town's ability to digest was extremely limited. If no one bought the manufactured industrial products, they were no different from scrap iron. It was necessary to let more people join in this revolution to set off a wave of new power applications. What could he get by selling the steam engine? Sufficient money, a large number of jobs, and a group of skilled workers. The latter had always been the most important. This was also the reason why Roland kept the output low. After Anna's ability evolved, the production efficiency was not the same as before. As long as there were enough raw materials, she could now cut out a dozen steam engines in a day. But selling such a product was simply selling the machine. If he wanted to drive this industry, he must set up a special team to be responsible for production, assembly, and maintenance. In Roland's plan, he only needed to open a factory and prepare the production tools, such as boring machines, planers, milling machines, and so on, and then hand over the production of the steam engine to the workers. It could be expected that the factory's production efficiency would be low in the early stage, and the quality of the products would be terrible, but slowly, everything would be on the right track. With the mother bed made by Anna, as long as they were familiar with the operation, the output would inevitably rise. The next step was to use the profits from selling the machines to expand the scale of production and train more technicians. The experienced workers gave the town the ability to produce higher quality products, such as steam trains, steam ships, and so on. Without a doubt, this was a virtuous cycle. The steam engines that he sold could also indirectly create benefits for him. If he used them in the mining industry, he could reduce the price of ore. If he used them in the shipping industry, he could promote trade. If he used them in the textile industry, he could make up for his shortcomings. Roland was eager to quickly popularize steam power throughout the country, as long as these machines were produced in Border Town. Once he unified Greycastle, it would save him a lot of effort. He had also considered the possibility of the buyer imitating the steam engine, but the new steam engine would use a round cylinder drilled by a boring machine, plus some deliberately designed complex parts. Relying on the current level of technology, he was afraid that it would be very difficult for them to produce a qualified machine in a short time, even if they had witches who specialized in high temperature. To be able to negotiate such a large order and find a channel to sell industrial products, Roland should have been elated. However, he realized that he was not happy at all. "It's sunny outside, why do you still have a bitter face?" Nightingale crossed her long legs and sat on the desk, holding a plate of dried fish slices in her hands. "Are you still worried about the news from the church?" When Scroll was not around, Nightingale's behavior was particularly casual, and she often stayed in the corner of the desk and the reclining chair by the wall. To the other lords, this was obviously an affront. However, Roland knew that he didn't care, and she also knew this. "I've been wondering why the church supported me and Garcia to compete for the throne at the same time, but now I understand. If my guess is correct, I'm afraid that Timothy has also received an invitation from the church." He frowned. In addition to the order, Marjorie also brought him a lot of information about King's City, one of which greatly surprised Roland. It was that the church had attacked and taken over the kingdom of Everwinter, and according to Marjorie, it seemed that they planned to take a step forward and launch an attack on the kingdom of Wolfheart. This news was like a bolt from the blue, and it connected all the ominous signs that had been lingering in his mind together. Supporting the three of you to compete for the throne at the same time? Not supporting, but consuming. Roland shook his head. The church doesn't care if the war spreads to the whole country, or in other words, they are happy to see Greycastle fall into internal strife. As for the churches and believers being involved in the war, it is not within the scope of their concern. Greycastle is not as weak as the kingdom of Everwinter. It has a vast territory and a large number of people, and if they attack it, the Judgment Army will lose more than half. Only after we kill each other will he be able to occupy the kingdom of Greycastle at the lowest cost. After that, they can have as many believers as they want, and they can build churches however they want. Those pills are just a well-prepared trap. The decree issued by Wimbledon III for the throne was equivalent to giving the church a chance to manipulate the situation. If Greycastle, the kingdom of Wolfheart, and the kingdom of Everwinter were destroyed one after another, the only kingdom of Dawn could not survive alone. The church's real purpose was probably to unify the four kingdoms. Considering the slow transmission of the news and the indifference of the people to the political situation, it was likely that people would only wake up when the church arrived at their doorstep. This was also the reason why Roland felt anxious. In this era, there was no basis to establish a united front, and it was a pipe dream to expect the nobles of Greycastle to cross the border to help. When the church's army arrived at the city, the last thing he could rely on was probably the people in the western region. But you also have a new weapon. The Judgment Army is not much stronger than the ordinary knight, I don't think they can defeat you. He remembered that when Nightingale mentioned the huge church, she only felt a sense of fear. Now she had such great confidence in himself, which was slightly beyond Roland's expectation. He forced a smile, but sighed in his heart. It was not difficult for Anna to produce a revolving rifle. The trial production of a revolving rifle and 2 revolvers, whether it was the reset trigger or the automatic wheel, were very good. But if the problem of firing bullets could not be solved, the new weapons would have no practical value. In the absence of the development of mercury fulminate, he had to use some substitute materials as the primer. I hope the guards who went to Redwater City can bring good news, Roland thought. At this moment, Lightning, who had regained her usual vigor and was in the middle of her daily training, flew into the office with unexpected news. The flag on a slope in the woods on the east side of Border Town had been changed to blue. Chapter 156. Theo climbed up a small hill, from where he could already vaguely see the outline of the Lord's castle in Border Town. I'm finally back, he thought. It took him nearly a month and a half to leave, but it only took him 7 days to return. Most of the time was spent on the road from Silver City to Redwater City. Although Ashes herself didn't care, he still chose a less traveled path to reduce the possibility of being watched by the church. Ashes was the witch who was called the Guide, but Theo wasn't sure whether this name was real or not. She always wore a black robe and carried a large sword wrapped in cloth on her back. Her long black hair was simply tied into a ponytail, hanging down to her waist. Whether it was riding or taking a boat, she rarely paid attention to herself. Instead, she walked alone in front, looking around at the scenery. Probably for her, this trip to border town was nothing more than a relaxing sightseeing trip. Sometimes Theo also doubted his own judgment. Was she really a warrior? Her robe wasn't tight, it was easy to trip her hands and feet, and her long hair was equal to many flaws. Moreover, Ashes didn't seem to be afraid that he would attack her from behind. These days, he mostly looked at her back. He didn't think that witches were born to trust others easily, he could only guess that she had enough ability to protect herself, even a god's stone of retaliation wouldn't be able to pose a threat to her. Theo circled around the hillside and soon found his target, a flagpole with a red strip of cloth. He dug out a bundle from the mud next to the flagpole and replaced the previous red flag with the folded blue cloth, then clapped his hands and sat down on the ground. "Is that it?" Ashes asked. "That's what they said." Theo wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Go to the foot of the mountain northeast of the town, go up a stone path, find the flagpole at the top of the mountain, and replace the blue flag, then our people will notice it. The Witch Cooperation Association will only act at night, we will wait here." Ashes nodded, found a clean place to sit down, and held out her hand. "Food." Wait." He opened his backpack, took out a piece of jerky, tore off half of it and stuffed it into his mouth, then threw the rest to the witch. Seeing the witch chewing the jerky in small bites, Theo couldn't help but sigh. In addition to a big sword on his body, he didn't even have a single copper eagle. Even though he was penniless, he still dared to swagger to border town with me. Along the way, he paid for the accommodation and meals. The room had to be a superior single bedroom, and the food had to be meat. Furthermore, he had to taste half of the food that was portable like dry rations. She was probably quite cautious in a field where she didn't have time to care about her abilities. However, wasn't the most prudent way to prepare the food himself? "The place we're going is across the channel." Ashes swallowed the jerky and suddenly said, "I don't know if you've heard the rumors about the fjords. There are countless islands there, and some of them have very harsh environments and are uninhabited. We will build a home for the witches there." Theo stared blankly. Previously, no matter how much he inquired, the other side had remained silent, so why did he suddenly take the initiative to mention this matter? "Don't you think it's strange that I didn't reveal any information to you before?" She earnestly explained, "Because if you were a liar, you would have taken advantage of me sleeping at night to inform the church, and those girls would most likely have been intercepted halfway and killed. But now, they should be on a merchant ship heading to the fjords, and even the church would be powerless to stop them. In addition, I came here to take away the witches of the Witch Cooperation Association. Sooner or later, they will know about this information, so continuing to hide it won't make much sense. But even if I brought you here, you can't rule out the possibility that I'm a liar." "That's right, it's true." Ashes said one word at a time. "If in the end it's not the witches, then you will die here, together with those who tried to harm the witches." "Well," Theo breathed a sigh of relief, "can I ask any other questions?" She thought for a moment. "If I can answer. Are you a person from Grey Castle?" "I've never seen such eyes." Theo decided to first ask about the other's origin. This kind of information was not sensitive, but it could also reduce the resistance in the other's heart. "I was born in the kingdom of endless winter, but this has nothing to do with the color of my eyes. Since I became a witch, my eyes have become like this." "Endless winter? That place is very far from Grey Castle, there are 2 kingdoms in between. How did you come to Silver City?" "I was sold into the church, and then..." She paused. "I wandered from the monastery in the old holy city all the way to the king of Grey Castle, until I met her, only then did my wandering life end." "Her?" Theo asked curiously. "Tilly Wimbledon," Ashes said with a warm look in her eyes. "She took me in." The guard's heart suddenly shook. When he first heard the name, he thought it was just a coincidence, but with the addition of Wimbledon's surname, the meaning was completely different. "The person who led the witches to the fjords, is it Roland Wimbledon's sister, the 5th princess of the kingdom?" His voice was somewhat stuttering. She is your leader. Leader? You can think of it that way, she nodded, but for me, she is the most important person, the kind that no one can replace. As the night fell, the two people lit a bonfire on the hillside. Ashes took off the great sword, little by little unwrapping the cloth. This terrible weapon's blade was nearly as wide as her waist, and it was covered with marks left behind by previous collisions. The gray-black edge of the sword didn't have a sharp edge. It was obvious that it only relied on the weight of its slash to take a person's life. For the average person, just lifting this weapon would be very difficult, but in her hands, it was as light as a one-handed sword. How many blacksmiths would she have to rob in order to gather the materials needed to forge such a great sword? Theo thought, if His Royal Highness's witches didn't arrive soon, maybe I will become a victim of the sword. I heard that the Lord of Border Town is also Wimbledon. He decided to find something to say, otherwise the waiting time would be particularly difficult. Roland Wimbledon, the fourth Prince of Greycastle, she said calmly, I have seen him before. What? Theo opened his mouth wide. After I was taken in by Tilly, I served as her guard in the palace, so naturally I had the opportunity to meet her siblings. Ashes seemed to have a very good understanding of the fourth prince, incompetent, arrogant, ignorant and incompetent. It is hard to believe that he is actually Tilly's brother. And, in some ways, his courage is not small. As she finished speaking, her tone gradually became cold. Theo couldn't help but shiver. When he had served in the palace, he had heard a lot of rumors about His Royal Highness, such as that he had a big mouth, a cunning mind, and liked to molest other people's maids. Although he didn't use force or violence to threaten the other side, it was inevitable that he would take advantage of them. It shouldn't be. At this moment, Ashes suddenly stood up, staring in the direction of the path. Someone is coming, more than one. Chapter 157. These people were all witches. Theo hadn't lied. Ashes could feel the magic that was being bred in their bodies, and could also roughly distinguish the strength of their magic. This was especially true for the one in front of them. Her magic was like a sharp knife. Just by concentrating on it she would feel a faint stabbing pain. My name is Ashes. It's a pleasure to meet you, Sisters of the Witch Cooperation Association. She put the giant sword aside and stepped forward to hug the four witches one by one. No, she thought, it should be 5. Ashes raised her head and stared at the black dot hovering in the sky. Is she not coming down? She will show us the way, the leader said with a smile. I am Nightingale. Then she pointed to the other 3 witches, Scroll, Leaf and Echo. Finally she pointed to the sky. That little girl is Lightning. Ashes was startled when she looked at Scroll. She could feel that the magic within her body was very weak, like a cloud covering her whole body. This feeling made her very surprised. Extraordinary. Nightingale also looked a little surprised. You can see magic? It's not seeing, it's feeling, Ashes explained. Extraordinary people can perceive the shape and flow of magic. This is because every part of the body has been transformed by it. I think this sister must have the same feeling as me. Scroll smiled and nodded. Indeed, it allowed me to find a lot of companions in the vast sea of people. Are extraordinary very rare? Nightingale asked. The other side's first concern is the number, not what is an extraordinary. Ashes thought, could it be that the Witch Cooperation Association has also heard of the existence of extraordinary witches? This was a strictly forbidden secret of the church, because the ability of an extraordinary directly affected their own body, and was not restricted by the god's stone of retaliation. Any exposed extraordinary would be the church's top enemy. Probably in thousands of witches, there will only be one extraordinary. Thinking so in her heart, her face was still as usual. So far, among my fellow witches I have seen, including Scroll, there are only 3. Ashes paused for a moment. Right, I remember that the leader of the Witch Cooperation Association was called Kara. Is she okay? She's dead. Nightingale shook her head. She died while searching for the sacred mountain. What a pity, Ashes said in a low voice. But what caught her attention was that when they talked about this issue, they did not show too much sadness. Then who is your new leader now? Let's go back to Border Town first and then we can slowly talk. she smiled. You'll see him soon. After the group entered the small town, Ashes discovered that something was wrong. These witches of the Witch Cooperation Association were holding torches and openly walking on the street. Moreover, even after nightfall, the town was not completely silent. Many of the house's paper windows revealed a faint firelight, and if one listened carefully, one could even hear the sound of children reading aloud. Although candles were not very expensive, the commoners had limited savings. They would not easily use them unless it was absolutely necessary. In a small town at night, there were so many residents lighting candles, it was already an incredible scene. Coupled with the sound of reading word by word, were they teaching their children to read? But since the other party did not mention it, she was too lazy to ask. In any case, this was not a place to live for long. What she had to do was to take everyone away as soon as possible. Passing through the crisscrossing streets, the group was getting closer and closer to the castle area. Ashes could already see the dark walls and the guards standing guard in the night. Where are we going? She could not help but ask. Border Town Castle, we will soon arrive. The one who answered her was Nightingale. Wait, she could not help but slow down, that is the place where the Lord lives. Yes, it is also the home of the witches. Could it be that you have reached an agreement with the Lord? Ashes frowned. Even if the local forces of the Witch Cooperation Association were strong, it would still be difficult to compete with the Lord and the Church, who had the God's Stone of Retaliation. Therefore, the only possibility was to cooperate. This was also one of the ways for the witches to survive. Unfortunately, in the face of the weak witches, most of the lords were unwilling to sit down and talk about the conditions fairly. Instead, they were endlessly squeezing and demanding, so this road was quickly blocked. That's right, Nightingale's tone did not show much unwillingness to be oppressed, but instead seemed to be enjoying it. At least we have signed a contract with His Highness. But Ashes was unable to feel happy for them. The contract was something written on paper and pen, it was not binding at all. When the Lord was tired of paying or wanted to terminate the equal relationship, he only needed to crumple it into a ball and throw it into the fireplace. No one would stand up for the witches. Their position was like a lonely boat in the middle of the sea, in danger of capsizing at any time. Fortunately, I came, she thought, I will take them away from here and go to the other side of the sea. There, the witches would build their own home, far away from the church and the secular world. After passing through the castle gate, sure enough, the guards were accustomed to the appearance of the witches and even greeted each other. Compared to the palace in King's City, the Lord's castle was undoubtedly much narrower and darker. There were only a few lonely torches hanging on the walls of the corridor, the flickering light was unable to cover the entire stone floor. Walking through it made people feel somewhat depressed. Only when they entered the living room did the lights suddenly brighten. In the hall, Ashes saw more witches, they seemed to have been waiting here for a long time. When they saw her appear, they all applauded to show their welcome. Nightingale took 2 steps forward and was about to make a simple introduction, when a witch suddenly rushed over. Vendi! Someone shouted. Ashes noticed the other's action, but did not take any countermeasures, she could feel the other's surprise and joy, but there was no hostility. Soon, a warm body embraced her. You actually survived, the other's voice was full of excitement. Thank you for saving me. Ashes was startled, you are, my name is Vendi. She let go of her hands and looked straight into Ashes's eyes, the little girl from the choir. Do you still remember me? In the bedroom on the 2nd floor, only Ashes and Vendi were left. She did not expect to meet her companions from the monastery here. Saying that they were companions was a bit of a stretch, if not for that night, she would not have crossed paths with Vendi. In fact, at that time, she did not notice that in the room buried under the ground, there was another unfortunate person like her who had been forcibly taken here. She would never have thought that the other person would eventually become a witch. After I escaped from the monastery, I settled down in Sea Wind County. Vendi was silent for a long time before she said, Later, I heard that the monastery seemed to have caught fire that day, and the children inside were also missing. Fire? Ashes shook her head. That was the church's own doing, to cover up the scandal. I killed some of the managers and the judgment army who tried to stop me, until the church's God's punishment army arrived. The scar on my eye was left by them. If I hadn't made a prompt decision to escape, I'm afraid I would have died there when the God's punishment army arrived. Chapter 158. The church's most elite warriors, they are also the top secret weapons used to fight against the extraordinary witches, Ashes said. They are not inferior to me in strength and speed, and... She hesitated. They don't seem to have any consciousness to speak of. During the fight, I cut off the right hand of a God's punishment soldier, but he did not hesitate to use his left hand to gouge my eye. Even if I turned around and ran away, his movement was not affected. This has nothing to do with willpower. Even if a strong person can still maintain their fighting spirit after losing an arm, they will not be able to adapt in a short time. I've only heard of the church's army of judges, Vendi murmured. Since they have such powerful warriors, why didn't they appear during the previous round of witches? I don't know, Ashes slowly said. Even the name of the God's punishment army, I only heard it from some people after I returned to the old holy city. You went back? Vendi asked in surprise. Yes, how could I let those dregs go so easily? She stood up and walked to the window. I later attacked several small churches and a judgment army station. There happened to be a presiding judge in the station, so I thought they were really not afraid of death. In the face of death and suffering, the other side's performance was not much better than the civilians. They would also show a look of fear, and they would also open their mouth to beg for mercy. From him, I learned the name of the God's punishment army. They were all transformed through a ceremony into the army of judges, and only the best warriors can receive this honor. Accepting the transformation must be voluntary. It seems that the success rate has a great relationship with the strength of the will. In other words, the God's punishment army is different from the witches. They are not formed naturally or because of their talent, but they are artificially transformed. Vendi was shocked by this news and was speechless. I guess they can't use the God's punishment army in the battle like the army of judges, perhaps because of the side effects of the transformation. In a sense, the warriors who have lost their minds are no different from monsters. Ashes sighed. During that time, I hid in the sewers or deep wells during the day, and came out at night to attack the church's believers. Until the church launched a citywide search, I was forced to evacuate from the old holy city. On the day I left, the blood on my body stuck tightly to my clothes and skin. I looked hideous. Perhaps in the eyes of outsiders, I was also a beast that had lost its mind. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It doesn't matter now, you can live a good life here like an ordinary person. His Royal Highness is very good to the sisters. After experiencing the months of demons and the attack of the Duke of Longsong's stronghold, most of the townspeople accepted the existence of witches. This town is the sacred mountain we were looking for. Ashes looked at the woman who was leaning against the windowsill with her. In her impression, the children living in the convent were all thin and weak, and their eyes were gray and dull. Looking at Vendi now, it was hard to imagine what she looked like when she was a child. Whether it was her figure or appearance, they were completely different from the children of that period. Moreover, the natural gentleness in her tone also made her feel peaceful and tranquil. However, there were some things that she had to say. I won't stay here, and I didn't come here for this. She paused. I want to take all of you away, to a place where it's really safe. Border Town is not a place to stay for a long time. You won't stay here. Vendi was stunned for a moment. Why? As long as you live on this continent, you will always be threatened by the church. Tilly has already gathered most of the witches in the kingdom of Grey Castle to go to the fjords, intending to build a country of witches there. But isn't there a church in the fjords? Because of the special topography of the archipelago, the islands are separated from each other, so their influence can only be maintained in a small area. And Ashes raised the corner of her mouth. There is no God's punishment army on the island. It was time to let them experience the wrath of the witches, thunder. Island by island, the church's power would be uprooted, just like how they eliminated the witches. You and your sisters must leave, Vendi. She continued to persuade, spreading rumors to attract companions is a mistake. I can hear these news, and the church can also hear it. They will never allow a witch organization to wantonly expand. I think it won't be long before the church's army crosses Grey Castle to destroy you. In the face of the invincible God's punishment army, do you think that the fourth prince will still protect you? No secular lord will be willing to live or die with a witch. Now he may be good to you, but in a time of danger, he will not hesitate to abandon you. Vendi was silent for a moment, then said, I don't know what the other sisters will think, but I will not leave Border Town. We are already at the edge of the cliff, Ashes frowned. Staying here for another day will increase the danger. If in order to avoid the coming danger, we abandon His Royal Highness and leave Border Town. What is the difference between this and him abandoning us? I don't want to become such a person, and... She took a deep breath. I don't think that His Royal Highness will be like you said, he will succumb to the pressure of the church. Nightingale once asked him the same question, and His Royal Highness' answer was, to let every witch in his territory be able to live like a normal person, even if he has to become the enemy of the church. Ashes didn't answer. For a moment she didn't know what to say. She had seen too many broken promises, and even if the other side was willing to protect the witches, what would be the point? In the face of overwhelming power, it would only increase the sacrifice. However, she had already figured out the situation of the Witch Cooperation Association. After the death of Kara the Snake Witch, the remaining members of the Witch Cooperation Association had basically been accepted by the Lord of Border Town. Theo, who had gone to Silver City to spread the news, was afraid that he wasn't a civilian who happened to rescue the witches, but rather a personal guard of the Lord. Although she didn't know what kind of cunning means he had used to make the witches trust him so much, but under the threat of her sword, it was likely that his carefully constructed camouflage would soon fall apart. I want to talk to your lord, Roland Wimbledon, Ashes finally said in a deep voice. She saw His Royal Highness the Fourth Prince the next morning. Ashes was brought into the office by Nightingale, where she once again saw the disgusting man. Although she didn't want to admit it, he did have the same blood as Tilly. His long grey hair was simply tied behind his head with a headband, emitting a little silver light in the morning light, which was the symbol of the royal family of Greycastle. His eyebrows and nose were also somewhat similar to Tilly's, but the more similar they were, the more she didn't like them. His appearance was different from the one she had often seen in the palace. His clothes were unusually clean, and in addition to his well-fitting clothes, she couldn't see a single ornament, no earrings, necklaces, rings, or bracelets. He was simply sitting in a chair, but she had a feeling that he was looking down on her. The temperament of a superior. Her mind couldn't help but think of this. Well, just from his appearance, he has indeed improved. Ashes coldly said in her heart, I don't know how long you can maintain this posture. Welcome. I heard that your name is Ashes. The other side took the initiative to speak. You are the messenger sent by my sister, right? I decided to come to Border Town on my own. But you are still a messenger, right? Ashes frowned. What was the point of emphasizing the word messenger? She didn't want to be entangled in unimportant things, yes. Chapter 159. Before Roland met the new witches, he had already listened to Theo's detailed report. Please go to Literature Building. He didn't expect that the long-lost Tilly Wimbledon would actually become the leader of another witch organization. Moreover, she was ahead of him and had already gathered more than half of the witches in the Greycastle Kingdom. What was even more intolerable was that now she actually wanted to extend her claws into his own territory. According to Nightingale, the witch in front of him was an extraordinary, and her ability was likely to be a combat type. Any extraordinary deserved to be treated with caution, so when he met with Ashes in the office, besides the invisible Nightingale, Roland also stood beside Anna. In front of the desk, there were several extremely thin black flames that formed a wall that was invisible to the naked eye. If she dared to rush over, she would be cut into several pieces by these thin lines. When strengthening witches didn't wear a god's stone of retaliation, they didn't have an advantage in the witch war, but once they wore the stone, they would have unrestricted destructive power. Fortunately, the god's stone was hated by the vast majority of witches. Ashes probably also considered this point, so when she came to Border Town to win over the witches, she didn't bring any of the church's iconic items. You're witches. Don't be arrogant, they are all living people, not your personal belongings. Ashes coldly said. Roland suddenly choked. It was the first time since he had crossed over that he felt the embarrassment of a failed verbal cannon. Usually he was used to saying things like, my people, and so on, but now he was unexpectedly criticized by a democratic speech, making him extremely embarrassed. Although according to the convention of this era, there was no problem with the Lord calling the people or things in his territory that way, but now in front of Nightingale and Anna, emphasizing this point was purely a lack of EQ, and he was led into a pit by the other side. So he coughed twice, and readily said, I never thought so. They stayed in Border Town out of their own will, and I believe, this is the best place for them. As for the fjords you mentioned, the journey across the sea itself is very dangerous. The climate of the fjords is unpredictable, and it is attacked by storms and tsunamis all year round. It is not a suitable place to live. But at least there, the power of the church is negligible. Witches can rely on their own power to transform their homes and fight against natural disasters, but there is no way to fight against the church with the god's stone of retaliation, let alone the god's punishment army. Ashes said mercilessly, do you know what a stupid thing you've done? Spreading the news will only tempt the church to come to you. With all due respect, you have no way to fight against the god's punishment army. Letting the witches leave your territory is the right way to avoid tragedy. Roland had heard about the god's punishment army from Vendi before, so he knew that persuasion was more effective than any words. Of course, he could ignore Ashes, but in this way, he would completely give up on fighting for Tilly Wimbledon's witches. Even though the chances were slim, he still wanted to try. How many god's punishment army can you fight at the same time? He asked. Ashes looked a little confused, but in the end she still stretched out 3 fingers. If it's 3, I can still handle it. Then let's have a match. Roland sat up straight and said seriously, let the result of the match tell you whether or not I can win against the god's punishment army. What did you say? Ashes was stunned for a moment, and her cold face finally showed a different expression. A fair match, 1-on-1. He said word by word, if I can defeat you, it will prove that I have the ability to resist the church, right? Ashes showed a, are you crazy, expression, you and me? Or, do you want the witches to fight? Of course not me, and definitely not a witch. The god's punishment army certainly has a god's stone of retaliation. Roland smiled, your opponent is an ordinary knight. Although it was a pity that he could not personally participate in the battle, the other party was, after all, an extraordinary witch with extraordinary combat power. From Wendy's description, it could be seen that she had fought alone in the cloister and even escaped from the pursuit of a number of God's punishment army. Even if she was barehanded or with a wooden sword, she could still display extraordinary lethality. As for the effect of a revolver in actual combat, it still remained to be seen. For safety's sake, he decided to give this glorious task to Carter. If he had an AK-47 in his hand, then no matter what, he would have to do it himself. An ordinary knight. Ash's expression returned to its original indifference. If I win, will you let the witches go with me? Of course not, just like if you lose, I can't let Tilly gather all the witches in Border Town, right? Then what's the point of this duel? It's not a duel. It's a competition, Roland corrected. The point is to let you know, in the face of the church, I'm not without the power to resist. And if you lose, when you go back, you will naturally remember, if you can't stay in the fjords, there is still a place in the western region where the witches can live. Of course, if you win, when you persuade Vendi, you will at least be more persuasive, won't you? It's impossible for me to lose, Ashes said, now call your knight. Not now, Roland waved his hand, after a week, I can make the necessary preparations for the competition. During this week, you can live in the castle and experience the life of a small town with the witches. Maybe you will change your previous opinion. She looked at the prince for a while, then nodded, maybe we don't have to wait for 7 days, they will change their opinion and leave Border Town with me. Roland shrugged. Just as she turned around and walked to the door, he suddenly called out to her, wait. Have I seen you somewhere before? Although he was sure that he had never seen this face, looking at the figure behind him, there was an inexplicable feeling of familiarity. Roland recalled a little, this familiar feeling seemed to come from the palace in King's City. Didn't your guards tell you? She didn't look back. If it wasn't for Tilly stopping me, I'm afraid you would only have one hand left in the palace. After the office door closed, Nightingale appeared, whistling, have you also touched her buttocks? What? Roland was startled, I don't remember there being such a person in the palace. And what do you mean by, also, touching? Nightingale mouthed a word, he could tell that it was, tear. Damn it, although I did touch the head maid's buttocks, I was afraid of being seen through, so I did it according to the usual practice. I haven't even argued with you about the peeping matter. Ahem, Anna interrupted the conversation between the two, do you really have the confidence to let the knight defeat the extraordinary witch? If he fails, it may affect the other witch's confidence in you. Fortunately, Anna still looked calm. Roland breathed a sigh of relief, although the self-strengthening witches are not affected by the god's stone of retaliation, they still fight with their own body functions. Compared with the rapid-fire weapons, the limitations of the body are too great. I think the odds of winning are at least 70%. Chapter 160. Roland had been thinking about revolving firearms bullets for a long time. The round lead bullets and loose gunpowder were too backward. Taking into account Anna's processing ability, it was technically feasible to directly manufacture the copper shell ammunition. The key was how to ignite the black gunpowder in the cartridge case without a reliable primer. The primer of the early metal shell ammunition was generally mercury fulminate, which was extremely sensitive to impact. Pulling the trigger to trigger the firing pin would stimulate the mercury fulminate at the bottom of the bullet to ignite the propellant and shoot the bullet out of the chamber. Unfortunately, no matter how much he racked his brains, he couldn't remember what kind of raw materials were needed to produce mercury fulminate. From the literal meaning, there must be nitric acid and mercury, but from the handwritten reaction formula, he could see that the reaction between these two substances would only produce mercury nitrate. Moreover, knowing the raw materials did not mean that he could smoothly produce the finished product. During the reaction process, whether the concentration and temperature of the solution was required, and whether or not he needed to add a catalyst were also key factors that affected the finished product. Moreover, because of the sensitive characteristics of mercury fulminate, it was easy to trigger an explosion during the production. If he was not careful, he would lose 2 fingers, so he didn't dare to try it himself. Therefore, Roland had to settle for the next best thing. In the case of using a metal cartridge case, he still used the flintlock ignition method. This required the spark to enter the cartridge case and ignite the gunpowder. Therefore, first of all, there must be a hole at the bottom of the cartridge case, and at the same time, to prevent the gunpowder from leaking out. Obviously, there was an irreconcilable contradiction between these 2 points, the bigger the hole, the faster the gunpowder would leak out. And if the hole was too small, it would be difficult for the spark to ignite the gunpowder inside. He needed something that could be smoothly ignited by the spark, and at the same time block the hole to prevent the gunpowder from leaking. The first thing that Roland thought of was nitrocotton, which was commonly known as collodion. This was also one of the few chemicals that he remembered could be used in weapons, because its preparation material was very simple. Cotton was soaked in a mixture of 2 strong acids. The acids were the most commonly used sulfuric acid and nitric acid, and there was no danger in the production. He wanted to wait until he recruited an alchemist before he started the trial production of collodion, but now that he had set an agreement of 7 days, he decided to roll up his sleeves and do it himself. Picking up the quill, he wrote down the idea that had been brewing for a long time on the draft paper. First was cotton, preferably undyed cotton yarn, which had been moved back from the Duke's mansion and was now piled up in the castle warehouse. The cotton yarn needed to be degreased, otherwise the grease adhered to the surface would hinder the nitrification. The cotton yarn needed to be degreased, otherwise the grease adhered to the surface would hinder the nitrification process. But Roland had been busy developing agriculture and fighting foreign enemies, so he had no time to develop this daily necessities. However, Roland had been busy developing agriculture and fighting against foreign enemies, so he didn't have the time to develop this kind of daily necessities. As for how to make sodium hydroxide, the simplest was probably the electrolysis of salt. So the prince found that, in order to make a new bullet, he had to start with a direct current generator. Moreover, she noticed that most of the witches would practice their abilities in the castle backyard, which meant that Roland had also found a way to avoid being bitten by magic power. Her original plan to use this vital information to exchange for the witches' favor had been shattered. In addition to explaining the pros and cons to them, and persuading them to leave, there was nothing else she could do. What surprised Ashes the most was Roland Wimbledon. His appearance hadn't changed much, but his gestures had an indescribable temperament, which was incompatible with his previous image of a playboy. Why was it like this? He used to be an incompetent person, and the first thing he would think of was to escape. Not to mention standing up for others, he was even afraid to take responsibility for his own actions. Thinking of the harassment, with just a hateful look, he panicked and fell to the ground. Tilly heard the noise and came over, but he lied and said that he accidentally fell down. He even blamed Princess Tilly for finding such an ugly woman to be her guard. From then on, Ash's impression of the fourth prince dropped to the lowest point. She had thought that such a person would be easy to deal with, but in today's negotiation, she was completely unable to gain the upper hand. Especially after the other side set a one-on-one competition, she found that she couldn't even use force to threaten him. Because the other side didn't evade the question, but intended to use a competition to answer her doubts. At this time, threatening him personally, in addition to reducing the witch's favor, had no other use. Ashes sighed. If only she could be as smart as Tilly, any problem in front of her would be easily solved. If she encountered such a situation, she would certainly be able to come up with a solution, right? The ease and expectation she had when she had first arrived had already disappeared. If it weren't for the fact that she wanted to help Tilly as much as possible, Ashes would have immediately boarded a ship heading for the port of Clearwater and left Grey Castle as soon as possible. Unconsciously, she found that she had already walked out of the range of the town, and the other side of the river was no longer a lush wheat field, but a woodland that had not yet been cultivated. Just as Ashes was about to turn back, she suddenly felt a fluctuation of magic behind her. She subconsciously turned her head, and a dagger pierced through her cheek, followed by a horizontal slash. The surging magic turned into a monstrous wave. Ashes felt that half of her cheek was stung. The other side's continuous moves were obviously not something an ordinary person could do. She no longer hesitated, letting her body fall completely, avoiding the dagger that swept in front of her eyes. She used one foot to eject herself. However, the other side disappeared into thin air, and in the blink of an eye reappeared behind her. Ashes couldn't even see how the other side moved. She pulled out her giant sword, and her body spun in a circle, causing the blade to produce a dull whistling sound. The speed was so fast that it raised a large amount of dust on the ground. This kind of attack without any blind spots could eliminate any threat within the attack range of the sword, but this trick was ineffective in the face of the other side's strange footwork. The giant sword swept through the position of the shadow, as if it had not touched anything. Oh no, she thought in her heart, her whole body tensed up, ready to take the next round of attacks, but the shadow disappeared in front of her. The dust slowly fell to the ground, and the person was standing not far from her, playing with the dagger in her hand. It was Nightingale. Is this a warning? Ashes frowned. Of course not, she put the dagger back into her waist. I just want to see the strength of an extraordinary. Really? I thought you wanted to say. I want you to quickly leave Border Town, otherwise I won't be polite to you. Nightingale interrupted, in that case, what difference is there between me and Kara? Kara? Why did she mention the former leader of the Witch Cooperation Association? Ashes was puzzled. You can rest assured to persuade each sister. If someone is willing to leave with you, I think His Highness will not stop you, and I certainly won't. But... Nightingale paused. Don't try to hurt or threaten His Highness Roland, otherwise I won't deliberately stab you next time. At this point, she grinned and disappeared into the air. Enjoy your life in Border Town. Chapter 161. The principle and structure of the DC generator were very simple. When Roland was a child, he had dismantled more than 10 motors of four-wheel drive vehicles, from ordinary white motors to the legendary Jin Chao, and he had even wound the rotor copper wire by himself. These motors were typical DC motors. There was no difference in structure between the DC generator and the DC motor. In essence, they were the same thing, and their functions could be interchangeable. As long as other machines drove the motor rotor to rotate, and the wires continuously cut the magnetic induction wire, it could generate a continuous flow of induced current. With the help of Mystery Moon and Anna, Roland only spent half a day to assemble a simple DC motor. The stator was made entirely of wood, and Mystery Moon gave it magnetism. The commutator at the end of the rotor was embedded in a log, and the center of the log had a hole, which could be connected to the steam engine shaft. This structure was not only convenient to make, but also guaranteed the mutual insulation between the commutator. As for the new steam engine, he and Mystery Moon watched Anna perform her amazing processing skills. When it was necessary to make large parts, she would spread out her black fire and wrap a pile of iron ingots like a cloth. After melting, she would shrink the black fire and press it into a plate that met the requirements, and finally cut it into shape. The next day, when Roland was ready to go to the backyard of the calcining room to test the effect of the generator, the guard brought him a piece of good news, which made him very happy. The chief alchemist from the Redwater City Alchemy Workshop had arrived in Border Town, and he was accompanied by more than one person. Kyle Sichi was very decisive. In the afternoon, he took his family and more than 10 disciples to board the merchant ship to Border Town. Unfortunately, after much hesitation, Chavez refused his invitation. He did not disclose the contents of the letter to other alchemists, because the more people who knew, the later the departure time would be. Kyle was worried that the news of the success of the crystal glass would soon reach the ears of the Duke, and then it would not be so easy to leave. For such a high-profit luxury product, the Duke would definitely want to keep it in his hands. He had written the formula and firing method of the crystal glass on a parchment, which was stored in the formula cabinet in the refining room, as a reward for the Duke's investment in building the alchemy workshop. But in front of the truth of alchemy, whether it was crystal glass or alchemy workshops, they weren't worth mentioning. 5 days later, Kyle finally met the person who had written the letter, the Lord of Border Town, Roland Wimbledon. In the castle's reception hall, he had just bowed and had not even sat down when he impatiently said, "Your Highness, I want to have a good talk with your alchemist." "My alchemist?" The other side smiled. "Before you came, there was no alchemist in Border Town. But now, you are my alchemist." "You mean, those alchemy formulas were written by you?" Kyle directly ignored the latter half of his sentence, his face turning pale. He suddenly thought of another possibility. The other party was a prince, and all the knowledge he received came from the palace tutors. If he knew all this, didn't it mean that the alchemy workshop of the king's city had already mastered the essence of alchemy? Yet, he was delusional enough to think that he was above them. This was simply too laughable. "Not exactly," Roland said. "These formulas came from an ancient book more than 400 years ago, and I found them by accident. It seems that hundreds of years ago, they called alchemy chemistry." "Chemistry? When Kyle heard that the formulas didn't come from the alchemy workshop of the king's city, his heart suddenly felt a lot better, but the answer given by the prince still surprised him. Alchemy books from more than 400 years ago. One must know that the alchemy workshop of the king's city only had a history of less than 200 years. Could it be that the later generations were not as good as the predecessors? Yes, in the books, those scholars mentioned a hypothesis, which is the theory of the immortality of matter. The matter that makes up everything in the world will not disappear or increase, it just changes from one form to another, such as this pastry. Roland pointed to the cake on the long table. After you eat it, part of it is absorbed by you, and part of it is excreted. If you add up the absorbed part and the excreted part, their mass should be equal. Wait. Your Highness, Kyle thought for a moment, if I burn a piece of wood into rice powder, no matter how I weigh it, the weight of the burned rice powder will be lighter than that of the wood. If the matter is immortal, then where does the missing part go? This is also explained in the book, Roland said with a smile, they become gas and water. The water is baked and evaporated by the flame, so in the end, you can only see the residue left. Gas? Kyle felt that something was about to come out of his heart. Does the air also have weight? Of course, all matter has mass. The prince nodded. It's very simple to verify this point. Put a pile of sawdust into the bottle, cover the mouth of the bottle and place it on the balance scale. When the balance is reached, you will ignite the sawdust. Eventually, you will find that the weight of the bottle will not change. Because the gas released from the combustion can't escape, it remains in the bottle. This is also written in the ancient book? Kyle asked eagerly, can you let me see that book? If you can promise me a few conditions, Roland said, spreading out his hands. Please go ahead. First of all, you have to work for me, and your salary will be calculated according to your salary in the Redwater City Alchemy Workshop. Second, once you accept this job, you must abide by the confidentiality regulations. That is to say, you must not disclose the content of your work to other alchemists. Third, if you agree, we will sign a contract. This contract will last for 5 years. After 5 years, you will be free to choose whether to stay or leave, and your alchemy results will no longer be restricted by the confidentiality regulations. You can show them to other alchemists or the Alchemy Guild. In return, if you accept these 3 conditions, Border Town will provide you with housing and a chemical laboratory. At the same time, I will lend you the book, Elementary Chemistry, to read. If there is anything you don't understand, you can ask me. It doesn't sound like harsh conditions, Kyle thought. Although words like confidentiality regulations and chemical laboratory were difficult to pronounce, he could still understand the general meaning. A 5-year contract was not too long. He had thought that the Lord would ask him to stay in Border Town forever. And, even if the conditions were harsh, he wanted to see the book that recorded the essence of alchemy with his own eyes. Thinking of this, Kyle got up and slightly bent down. I am willing to serve you, Your Highness. Very well, then it's settled. The prince didn't seem to care much about etiquette. Your workplace will be by the Redwater River. After signing the contract, I will take you to familiarize yourself with the laboratory, and introduce you to the use and operating procedures of the glassware. What made the chief alchemist feel a little strange was why His Highness talked about alchemy so skillfully, and even gave people a sense of confidence. Was he just an ordinary noble who had accidentally come into contact with an ancient alchemy book? But these were all minor details. He suppressed his doubts and asked, what does Your Highness want me to refine? Chapter 162. Full of lies, when Roland finished dealing with the alchemist's matter and returned to the office, Nightingale said aloud, what 450-year-old ancient book, wasn't Elementary Chemistry the textbook you wrote for Scroll to memorize? That thing will be taught to the people sooner or later, right? It's just a white lie. Roland picked up the cup and drank a mouthful of tea. Since the king's merchant Marjorie gave him a bag of black tea, he could finally say goodbye to the days of drinking plain water or ale every day. A prince living in the palace, how could he know so much about alchemy? If he did, it would be from the king's alchemist's teachings. See, the literature building gave him a textbook for him to study by himself, which is much easier to accept than me teaching him alchemy. After all, people always believe in themselves the most. Oh. Nightingale suddenly leaned over and moved closer to Roland. Then who taught you your knowledge? Ah. Roland had just opened his mouth, but Nightingale's finger stopped him. If you don't want to say it, don't say it. I don't want to hear you lie. He blinked, and the other side withdrew her hand. There are still 5 days before the competition. Roland took the opportunity to change the topic. I have to let Carter familiarize himself with the operation of the new weapon in advance. But didn't you say that the ammunition problem hasn't been solved? Collodion only affects its use in actual combat. If it's only for the competition, it's still possible to shoot 1 round with each gun. After all, during the competition, there's no need to worry about transporting bullets and reloading repeatedly. 10 bullets are enough to get the result, Roland said. Of course, the problem of the firing rate decreasing due to the lack of collodion was a matter of probability. This point could only be decided by God and Carter's face. West of the town's walls. Carter came to the previous explosive test field, accepting the new task assigned to him by Roland. Fight with a witch? The chief knight was startled. Can I wear a god's stone of retaliation? Of course you can, Roland said with a smile, but you are facing a special witch. The god's stone of retaliation is ineffective against her, and her fighting style is similar to that of a warrior, using a greatsword to attack. You mean, she is a witch who is proficient in close combat? Carter glanced at Nightingale, who was standing beside Roland. More or less, but because her ability is to strengthen herself, both her strength and speed are far superior to ordinary people. Roland said, you have to be mentally prepared. The opponent's physical fitness is probably several times higher than the death row inmates who were used to test the pills. Several times higher. Your Highness, do you know what that means? Carter's eyes widened. It's very likely that even if I had observed her movements, my body wouldn't have been able to react. If she really is as powerful as you say, I'm afraid I won't be able to defeat her. Theoretically speaking, your chances of winning are indeed 0. The prince handed over a strange-looking firearm. But with this, your chances of winning will greatly increase. This is a new flintlock. Carter took it with both hands. Because its trigger and barrel were very similar to that of a flintlock, the knight judged that they should belong to the same type of weapon. It wasn't big, but it was heavy in his hands, even heavier than a flintlock rifle. What was particularly eye-catching was that, except for the wooden grip, the entire gun body was made of metal. The smooth lines and corners, as well as the grayish-white metallic luster, had an indescribable beauty. Carter almost instantly fell in love with this weapon. Its name is a revolver. Roland took out another weapon with the same shape and ejected a beehive-like wheel to the left. Now I'll teach you how to use it. Carter quickly discovered that its operation method was much simpler than that of a flintlock rifle. The pellet and gunpowder were already connected, and as long as it was loaded into the middle wheel, it could be fired. There were 5 holes in the revolver, which could be loaded with 5 rounds of ammunition at a time. This was probably the reason why it was called a revolver. At the end of the revolver, there was a small hole corresponding to the revolver. As long as the trigger was pulled, sparks would burst out from the hole, accompanied by a sizzling sound. Maybe there was a piece of flint hidden inside, he thought. However, the design of this bullet was too exquisite. The light yellow shell was probably made of thin copper plates, and the whole body was perfectly round. The whole body was smooth, and you couldn't see any traces of joints. The front of the bullet was thin and the back was thick, and the tail was about the thickness of an index finger. It could very accurately fit into the hole of the cartridge. In the end, how was this made? This is an unfinished product, so you always have to pay attention to the opening at the bottom of the bullet. Roland made a shooting motion. Like me, the muzzle is slightly downward. Don't let the gunpowder leak out from the opening. After each shooting, you have to clean the bullet nest of the revolver, to avoid the scattered gunpowder accumulating in the hole. Unfinished product. Yes, the prince shrugged, there is still a key technology that needs to be solved. If everything goes well, you may be able to catch up before the competition. When the time comes, the opening at the bottom of the bullet will be sealed, and you won't have to worry about the problem of gunpowder leaking. Let's try shooting first. If the bottom was sealed, how could the gunpowder inside the bullet be ignited? Carter thought for a moment, then decided to give up thinking about this seemingly impossible problem. After all, he wasn't as knowledgeable as His Royal Highness. That's right, he was knowledgeable. Carter now admired His Royal Highness from the bottom of his heart. Whether it was a court scholar, a master alchemist, or an astrologer, no one could invent so many strange things like His Royal Highness. Moreover, these things had a very high practical value, unlike snow powder, people carrying kites, and the like, which could only be reduced to the aristocracy's toys. His Royal Highness's invention of the steam engine had already been used in the mine's mining and pumping operations, and the guns and cannons had repelled the demonic beasts and the Duke's coalition forces. Now, Carter firmly believed that as long as there was enough time, the one who would ascend to the throne of Grey Castle would inevitably be His Royal Highness Roland Wimbledon. The target stood 10 meters away, and at this distance, the human-shaped target was only the size of a palm. In accordance with His Royal Highness's teaching, he held the gun with both hands, slightly tilted his body, aimed the barrel at the target, and pulled the trigger. Sparks and gas sprayed from both sides of the wheel, and a loud noise shook his ears. He felt as if someone had pushed him, and his wrists unconsciously lifted up. When the smoke cleared, the target looked intact. "Continue," Roland said. Carter took a deep breath, and fired the remaining 4 bullets, but still, none of them hit the target. This. Carter looked at His Royal Highness, but the latter didn't seem to care. Chapter 163. Ashes sat at the top of the castle, waiting for the day of the duel. In the past few days, her persuasion had not made any progress. The stubbornness of the witches of the Witch Cooperation Association had far exceeded her expectations. Whether it was the older scroll or the underage Lily, they all refused her invitation. The only difference was that the way they refused was different. Some chose to stay because of Roland, and some didn't want to leave their sisters of the Witch Cooperation Association, leading to the 10 witches acting like an iron plate. As for Anna and Nana, who originally belonged to Border Town, she didn't even have the mood to try. Especially the former, when Ashes stood in front of her, she felt that the magic in Anna's body was completely different from the previous witches. The magic in Anna's body was like hard steel, smooth and dense, like an iron wall spanning across the two of them. Among the many witches that Tilly had gathered, no one had ever given her such a feeling. After inquiring about the other witches, she found out that Anna's ability was very common, the ability to control flames. Ashes was puzzled as to why the invisible flame made her feel as if there was a solid barrier in front of her magic power. As for this small town, it was very different from the towns or villages she had seen before. If she had to describe it, it would be that it was full of vitality, and people seemed to have endless things to do every day. From the top of the castle, she could see a panoramic view of the town. In the center of the town, where the population was the most dense, new houses were being built. They had planned the square site into a small district, and the houses in each district were almost the same. The carriage transporting bricks from the north didn't stop for even a moment. The stonemasons first dug a dozen pits of the same shape, and then began to stack the bricks. This kind of construction speed was amazing, and in almost a day, they could build a fence that was half the height of a person. Looking to the northeast, she could see the billowing smoke rising into the sky. It wasn't a forest fire, but rather a brick kiln at work. There were also several particularly thick brick towers being built. At first glance, they looked like piles of red giant trees that had been cut down. On the riverbank, there were several sailboats arriving at Border Town every day. From the flags hanging on the masts, most of them came from Longsong's stronghold. The goods that had been unloaded from the ships had almost filled the yard to the brim. There was a team of guards patrolling the yard with wooden spears. Unlike most city guards, they did not walk lazily for a while or simply find a place to hide and take a nap. Instead, they lined up in a straight line from beginning to end, walking between the dock and the yard. Sometimes, they even took the initiative to help unload the cargo. In Ash's memory, this was a scene that she had never seen before. What kind of magic did Roland Wimbledon have to make these people so passionate about building a remote and barren town? Just at this moment, a cooing sound came from above. Ashes raised her head and saw a huge fat pigeon descending from the sky and landing on her shoulder. "I've finally found you, coo." The pigeon rubbed her cheek. "Tilly sent you." Ashes took out a handful of wheat from her pocket and threw it on the roof. The pigeon flapped its wings and flew over. Suddenly, it seemed to realize something. "I'm not a bird, coo. Then turn into a human and talk to me." "Okay, coo." As soon as the voice fell, the pigeon's feathers suddenly swelled, and a white light penetrated through the gaps between the feathers. Then, a head came out, and the swollen feathers quickly shrank, turning into a bunch of long white hair. No matter how many times she saw it, Ashes would always be amazed. Maggie, a witch who could change into a variety of birds, except for her body size, all other details were wonderful. Sometimes she even envied her ability. Compared to the extraordinary magic of the god's stone of retaliation, she was more eager to be able to quickly travel between two places. That way, whenever she wanted to see Tilly, she could set off at any time. Even with the sigil of tracking, it's not easy to locate your direction. Maggie shook the fluff on her body. "The distance is too far, my magic stone statue can hardly feel the fluctuation of the sigil. Fortunately, Shadow knows where you are going, so I flew over the fallen dragon ridge." Only then did the statue show some reaction. In addition to her iconic white hair, her biggest characteristic was her short stature. Obviously, she was already an adult, but her hair reached her waist, and her appearance was that of a little girl. As long as her white hair was untied, it could almost wrap her whole body inside. "Has Tilly safely arrived at the fjords?" Ashes sat down and patted the tiles beside her. Like a bird, the other party obediently came over. Her empress arrived safely, but the second ship, the North Wind, hit a reef when it approached the shore, so no witches were killed. The third and fourth ships are still at sea. When I came to find you, I flew over their heads. That's good. Ashes was relieved. Although His Royal Highness looked disgusting, there was one thing he was right about. That was, the voyage from Grey Castle to the fjords was full of danger. Climate changes in the sea were far more rapid and violent than on land. In the blink of an eye, a storm could be set off in a clear blue sky, and under the overwhelming waves, extraordinary power seemed insignificant. "You all said the same thing," Maggie said. "Shadow said that you couldn't go back with us because you wanted to go to Border Town to win over more witches, not because there was a problem." Lady Tilly's first words were also, "That's good." She paused, her head looking around. "What about your companions? Where are they?" "They don't want to leave," Ashes sighed, and gave a brief account of what had happened. "Compared to me, they believe more in the lord of this place, that is, Tilly's brother. Lady Tilly is willing to accept us, and her brother is also willing to accept us." "Well, this doesn't seem to be a bad thing," she said, tilting her head. "In that case, you should leave for the fjords as soon as possible. Without your help, Lady Tilly can't carry out the cleaning plan." Ashes shook her head. "I have to wait until the end of the competition before I leave." "But you just said that even if you win, the other side won't take the initiative to drive away the witches." Maggie muttered, "Do you still want to complete the competition?" "If there is even the slightest chance, I want to try," Ashes said calmly. "It doesn't matter if I delay the cleaning plan for a few days, but if I can bring back one more witch, the power of Tilly will increase a lot." "Well," Maggie nodded, "then I will also wait here for you to go back together. But there is one thing you need to pay attention to. When passing through Fallen Dragon Ridge, I saw a group of people carrying the church's flag. There were about 10 of them. Chapter 164. Kyle Seachy had hardly slept these days, and he found that coming to Border Town was the best choice he had ever made in his life. He spent 2 days and 1 night reading through the entire elementary chemistry, and after sleeping for 2 or 3 hours, he was full of energy. Now he had returned to the first page, and began to carefully study the ancient book. Matter is composed of very small particles. The change of matter is the decomposition and reorganization of particles. During the reaction process, the total amount of matter remains the same. My God, what kind of person is the author of this book? He can even describe the world that people can't see so clearly. He had more than once suspected that the contents of the book were fabricated, but according to the examples of alchemy experiments, the results were completely consistent. Moreover, some common examples in reality could also prove the correctness of the book. For example, the oxygen, described in the first chapter. This gas is the main component of air, and people don't breathe air, but oxygen. Flames need oxygen to burn, because burning is essentially an oxidation reaction. The more oxygen there is, the more vigorous the combustion. These words reminded him of the glass kiln in Redwater City, where it required 2 people to constantly shake the blower to raise the temperature of the furnace to the melting point of sand and stone. Since it is a matter, it is obvious that through alchemy, through chemical reactions, pure oxygen can be extracted. If you can directly pass oxygen into the furnace, can you save the blower equipment? And the most surprising thing was that the book said that water is composed of 2 hydrogen particles and 1 oxygen particle, which is probably the reason why all living things drink water. But hydrogen seems to be a gas, and the 2 gases combine to form a liquid. How is this possible? Kyle found that he still had many questions to ponder. But there was no doubt that he had already walked ahead of all the alchemists. While they were still exploring the formula in the chaos and fog, a straight and flat road appeared in front of him. However, he still had to get down to business. He reluctantly closed the book. At this time, the sky was getting brighter, and it was time to work. Kyle blew out the candle, approached the bedroom, looked at his wife and daughter who were still sleeping, and quietly went out the door. The residence assigned to him by His Highness was located to the west of the castle, and it was much larger than his own home in Redwater City. The walls were made of bricks, and compared to the wood that was easy to mold, this kind of house was obviously much more comfortable, and it also had all kinds of furniture and kitchen utensils. Although he didn't say it out loud, he was quite satisfied. The disciples lived in a small district 2 streets away from him. The houses were smaller, and they were not individual houses. It was more like a hotel, with 1 bedroom for 4 people. Walking to the chemistry laboratory by the Redwater River, the disciples were already busy. They were carefully selected by Kyle, and they had been learning how to clean materials in the alchemy workshop since they were children. Now, they were between 20 and 30 years old. Kyle nodded with satisfaction when he saw the clean laboratory and the sparkling glass containers in front of him. Good morning, Lord Chief Instructor. All the disciples bowed their heads in greeting. Let's start. He took a pair of gloves from the cupboard and put them on. The gloves were extremely thin and flexible, probably made from animal intestines. There had never been such a rule in the alchemy workshop before, but His Royal Highness had repeatedly emphasized the danger of chemical experiments. In the operating rules, whenever there was a reaction with corrosive raw materials, they had to wear gloves and open all the windows. Unlike the workshop, now their job was very clear, which was to make acid for His Highness. They had already operated the method of making acid with 2 stones many times, so Kyle only needed to patrol and give directions, and didn't have to do it himself. These 2 acids were recorded in detail in elementary chemistry. One was called sulfuric acid, and the other was called nitric acid. Previously, he was used to naming them after the products, such as the former was called green vitriol, and the latter was called nitric acid. Although the names were different, the production method was basically the same. Through the dry distillation of green vitriol and nitric acid, the acid was condensed and collected. Green vitriol was usually associated with sulfur ore, and nitric acid was produced in large cities in special nitration tanks, so they were both common raw materials. However, His Royal Highness emphasized that the concentration of the two acids must be high, and specifically explained the method of purification. For example, after the sulfuric acid was collected, it could be heated to evaporate the water, and finally, the concentration could reach up to 98% concentrated sulfuric acid. However, nitric acid was a lot more troublesome. According to His Royal Highness, this acid itself was not very stable, and it was easy to volatilize. When the concentration reached a certain level, it would even decompose when exposed to light. Therefore, the dilute nitric acid produced by dry distillation had to be mixed with concentrated sulfuric acid, and then heated, so that the concentrated sulfuric acid could absorb the water, and then evaporate the nitric acid and store it in a brown glass bottle. For this reason, His Royal Highness had specially prepared a thermometer. At first glance, Kyle felt that this thing was really a wonderful workmanship. A hollow glass tube was filled with mercury, and both ends were sealed, so there was no need to worry about the mercury leaking out. There were several lacquer lines drawn on it, and when heated, the mercury would gradually rise, and the position where it finally stayed represented the current temperature. Today, the laboratory had produced 3 bottles of concentrated sulfuric acid and 1 bottle of concentrated nitric acid. At this concentration, he found that the sulfuric acid was not as easy to flow as water, but more like some viscous oil. At high concentrations, the nitric acid was no longer colorless and transparent, but became pale yellow. As long as the glass bottle was opened, it would emit bursts of white smoke. "Master, do we have to make these 2 kinds of acid every day?" a disciple named Amon asked. "Until His Royal Highness gives us a new task." Kyle paused. "What's wrong? Are you worried that you don't have time to explore the alchemy formula?" Amon nodded. Kyle touched the stubble on his chin and smiled. "I forgot to tell you, the alchemist title is no longer needed, so you don't have to rely on exploring the formula to become an alchemist." "No." Amon was stunned. "No need." The other disciples also slowed down their work, and listened attentively to the master's next words. "Yes, the alchemy formula no longer needs to rely on exploration, but memory and deduction." Kyle clapped his hands, and simply gathered everyone around him. "His Royal Highness gave me a book called Elementary Chemistry. This is also the reason why I brought you here. If you study it thoroughly, most of the world's formulas can be deduced from the contents of the book." "Deduced?" the disciples whispered. Chapter 165. Lightning shuttled back and forth through the hills south of Border Town, filling the parchment filled with squares in her hands one by one. This was the new task she had recently accepted, which was to cooperate with Soroya to draw a map of the Western Territory. If she flew with Soroya, the altitude would be greatly reduced, and it would be difficult to pass through the woods. Therefore, she first drew a rough outline, and then Soroya pieced them together to draw the whole map. Under the magic pen, the map looked the same as if it was looking from the sky, and every detail was lifelike. When the parchment was filled, Lightning turned around and returned to Border Town. Today, after several months of practice, her flying speed was getting faster and faster, and according to His Highness Roland's calculation, her speed was almost 120 kilometers per hour. At this speed, the strong wind blowing against her face almost made her unable to open her eyes. She thought that this was the limit of what she could achieve, but just the day before yesterday, His Highness gave her a gift. It was a leather headband, wrapped in 2 copper rings, and one side of the copper rings was inlaid with pure transparent glass. As long as she wore it, she would be able to stay away from the wind. His Highness said that this was called windproof glasses, which were made when he was making glassware. He also said that with this, she would be more like a little Israel. Lightning didn't know who Israel was, but she understood that it took a lot of effort to join the leather, copper rings, and lenses together. Each piece of leather had a double layer of stitching, and the inner side of the copper rings was tightly wrapped, so there was no need to worry about scratching the skin. The back also had a buckle similar to a belt, which could be adjusted at will. It didn't look like something that was casually made. She immediately fell in love with this gift, and almost slept with it on the top of her head. Now, as long as she pulled down the windproof glasses, she could fly as fast as she wanted, no longer having to pay attention to the whistling wind in her ears. After a while, lightning arrived over the town, and was about to return to the castle to give the grid map to Soroya, when a white figure suddenly passed by the corner of her eyes. Looking sideways, she saw a pigeon spreading its wings and gliding in the direction of Longsong's stronghold. Pigeons were not rare birds, but this one was different. It was too fat. Just its wings alone were enough for him to gnaw on for a day. Lightning swallowed her saliva. She remembered the time when she was stranded on a deserted island, catching fish and birds with her own hands and roasting them over a bonfire. Although the food provided by His Royal Highness was also very sumptuous, she had been eating butter bread and mushroom soup for a whole month, and she was already somewhat tired of it. If only she could catch a pigeon and roast it. She touched the small bag of salt and pepper on her waist and made up her mind. With a turn, lightning dashed straight towards the pigeon, who quickly noticed the uninvited guest. It folded its wings and swooped down, as if it wanted to drill into the forest and get rid of its menacing pursuer. Lightning was slightly stunned. She didn't expect this pigeon to be so smart. Then she grinned, turned sharply, and chased after it. Since the months of demons, when she had lured the hybrid demonic beasts, the little girl was confident that nothing could escape from her eyes. Sometimes the pigeon would fly over the treetops, sometimes it would fly at a very low altitude, flying close to the ground. However, the distance between the two was getting shorter and shorter. No matter how hard it flapped its wings, it was unable to get rid of lightning. The forest quickly retreated, and the sun shone through the dense branches. Light and shade alternated, until they passed through an open area. The surroundings suddenly became empty and bright. Seizing this opportunity, she raised her speed to the limit, and in a flash, she hugged the pigeon from behind and pressed it to the ground. The pigeon struggled hard but was unable to break free from her grasp. Lightning pulled out a knife from her waist, ready to kill her prey, but the other suddenly opened its mouth. "Don't coo. Help me coo." The little girl shivered, and was so scared that she almost dropped the knife. But she quickly recovered. "Are you a witch?" The pigeon nodded again and again. "I thought I could change my taste." Lightning regretfully sighed and put away her knife. "My name is Lightning." "What's your name?" The other swelled up, and then turned into a human shape. "Maggie, you actually wanted to eat a bird," she accused. "I ate a lot before." Lightning shrugged and reached out to pull her up. Suddenly, a bead rolled out of her arms, bounced twice on the ground, and fell into a small pit. Lightning walked over to pick up the bead, and when she was about to hand it back to Maggie, she found that this glass-like transparent red bead was engraved with a string of strange runes, which looked very familiar. She frowned and thought for a moment, then hooked the string around her neck, and took out a dark red pendant from her chest. Comparing the two in her hand, she found that the runes on them were exactly the same. "Huh?" Maggie poked her head out from behind. "You also have a tracking sigil." "What is a tracking sigil?" "You don't know? This thing can be sensed by a magic stone, and can locate the holder's position." She paused. "No, why should I tell you? You just wanted to eat me." "Do you have a magic stone?" "No." Maggie shook her head. "So you can locate my position?" Lightning asked curiously. "No, you must have a matching magic stone in order to locate the corresponding sigil." This time she answered very quickly, "And only witches can use it." "You don't know anything, so how did you get it?" "My father gave it to me when I was a child." Lightning returned the bead to the other. "What about you?" "I'm not telling you." Maggie made a face, then curiously looked at the former. "Are you a witch of the Witch Cooperation Association? I heard from Ashes that you don't want to leave Border Town. Are you one of her people?" Lightning curled her lips. "I thought you were a newcomer attracted by the rumors." Everyone is living well here, why would they want to leave? Because it's dangerous, the church may send an army at any time. An explorer won't be timid because of danger, Lightning said, her face slightly red. Well, the trip to the stone tower doesn't count. When I go to the ruins next time, I must be the first to step into the basement. Moreover, His Highness Roland has a lot of incredible inventions. As long as you see them, you will definitely be attracted to them. One of them is a weapon that can shoot fist-sized iron balls, and anyone who touches it will be torn to pieces. Really? Can you take me to see it? Maggie exclaimed. That won't do, unless you join the Witch Union and become one of us. But I have to take Ashes back. She hesitated. Then you can take her back, Lightning persuaded. There are a lot of fun things here. There's a machine that moves by itself when boiling water. There's a weapon that can attack the enemy from a kilometer away. How far is a kilometer? In short, it's very far. People will only look the size of a tree branch. She gestured with her hands and feet, and in the concealing forest, there are even more places to play. Poking a beehive, picking mushrooms is nothing, but hunting birds and wild boars is interesting. After peeling off the fur, you can roast it over the bonfire until it's shiny, and then sprinkle salt and pepper on it. It will be delicious. Really? Maggie couldn't help but lick her lips. Chapter 166. On the 5th day, Roland finally prepared all the raw materials for the production of collodion. During the electrolysis of salt water, he made a serious mistake. He used the copper strip left by Anna to cut the bullet as an electrode, which resulted in the electrode being dissolved, wasting a basin of salt water. In order to prevent chlorine gas from dissolving in water during electrolysis, the electrolyte was usually saturated salt water, and salt was not a cabbage in this era. Therefore, when he poured away the waste salt water which had been mixed with copper ions, Roland felt that he had thrown away several golden dragon bullets in vain. Finally, he replaced the electrode with a carbon rod to solve the problem. After boiling the water with caustic soda to remove the grease, he brought the remaining caustic soda to the chemistry laboratory. The esterification of collodion was the most important step in the production process. He did not know the principle behind it, but he knew that the gauze had to be soaked in a mixture of acid, and after the nitrification was complete, it could be taken out. The ratio of the solution and the reaction time were all unknown. Roland let Kyle divide the samples into several groups to control the time using an hourglass. After soaking the gauze, he repeatedly washed it with water, and then soaked it in a solution of sodium hydroxide to remove the excess acid. The wet finished products were transported back to the castle and handed over to Vendi to be air-dried. Due to the use of a high concentration of fuming nitric acid during esterification, most of the trial products could be quickly ignited. Among them, 1 part nitric acid and 2 parts sulfuric acid soaked collodion had the best effect. After obtaining the general formula, the laboratory started mass production. After soaking and washing the collodion, it was immediately transported by the soldiers of the First Army. Even the chief alchemist did not know the use of the things they had made. The air-dried gauze was cut into fingernail-sized cubes by the maids, packed and sent to the North Slope Mountain, where it was finally loaded in the backyard of the firing room. In the absence of machines, this process could only be completed by manpower. A group of personal guards spread out and gently inserted the collodion gauze into the bottom of the cartridge case with a wooden stick, sealing the ignition hole. Then, they poured the granular black gunpowder into the cartridge case through a funnel and compacted it layer by layer, keeping the amount of each cartridge as consistent as possible. The last step was to press on the bullet. The bullet processed by Anna and the cartridge case had a very high degree of adhesion. After pushing it in with bare hands, they could then gently hit it a few times with a hammer. The efficiency was a bit low, but they could still produce hundreds of bullets a day. On the 6th day, Carter was finally able to use his new weapon. As the chief knight, who had excellent physical qualities in all aspects, his accuracy had greatly improved after a few days of repeated practice. Compared to Roland's performance in military training, it was like the difference between clouds and mud. After reloading the flintlock, Carter finally did not have to use the strange shooting posture of his wrist drooping down to hold the gun. As long as the sealing cotton did not break, the cartridge would be kept clean. At the same time, it was several times more sensitive to sparks compared to black gunpowder, so the firing rate was also guaranteed. Taking advantage of the last day, Roland let Carter Lannis practice drawing his gun quickly and shooting with 2 guns. Even with black powder, the recoil of the 12mm pistol was very impressive. It was difficult to guarantee a hit rate of the second shot when holding the gun with one hand. But in Roland's plan, this was a counterattack when Ashes was behind him. Carter would carry 2 guns on the stage. If it was a tug of war, 10 bullets would be enough to determine the winner. If he was closed in the beginning, he could also quickly pull out the other gun to counterattack. And considering that the opponent's weapon had a certain defensive ability, Roland deliberately chose steel bullets that were not easy to deform to increase the penetrating power and reduce the killing power of the cavity. In addition, due to the limitations of the smelting technology in this era, Ashes's greatsword was most likely made of pig iron. An exaggerated shape would not improve the quality of the weapon. On the contrary, if the huge iron weapon was not sufficiently forged, the internal stress distribution would be even more uneven. It could not be called a good shield. From Roland's point of view, the greatsword was at most a white-grade weapon. If one's luck was not particularly bad, the possibility of ricocheting was very low. If Ashes wanted to defeat Carter, she must first get close to the knight. This was the natural disadvantage of a cold weapon against a hot weapon. As long as it was not exaggerated to the point where one could see the trajectory of the bullet and dodge the bullet, this distance was an insurmountable gap. It was not until the sky was getting dark that Ashes waited for Maggie to fly back to her room. "Why did you come back later and later these days?" she asked after closing the window. "Lightning took me to catch a bird." Maggie changed back to her human form and took out a roasted bird leg from her waist bag. The overflowing fragrance suddenly filled the room. "I specially saved it for you." "I ate it." Ashes shook her head. "Is Lightning a witch of the Witch Cooperation Association?" "Yes," she nodded vigorously. "Her ability is the same as mine, flying, but it is much more convenient to use." After a pause, she then asked, "Sister Ashes, do you really want to fight this battle?" "I think they won't go with you. Moreover, they are living a good life here." Ashes was startled and did not answer. "Because even I want to stay here." Maggie sat on the bed and said, "The bed is soft, and the food is good. I saw that during lunch, the Lord specially set up the table in the backyard, so that the witches could eat together after they finished their practice. Everyone was talking and laughing, and he would occasionally add 1 or 2 sentences, which was completely different from the other nobles who hated him. In the afternoon, I was dragged by Lightning to play Gwent, where 2 people draw 10 cards and compete with each other. In the end, the one with the most points wins. It was very interesting. They also gave me 2 sets of cards. Sister Ashes, do you want to play? I can teach you." "No." Ashes shook her head and took a deep breath. These days, she was aware of Maggie's change, but until now, she suddenly realized that her thinking seemed to have fallen into a misunderstanding. Most of the witches lived in fear, and a stable and comfortable place to live was all that they pursued. For example, before she was accepted by Tilly, Maggie had been hiding in a thatched hut in the slums of King City. Just like a real bird, she spent every night curling up in the narrow cracks of the roof beams. Even when Tilly decided to cross the sea to the east, Maggie was still running around, contacting the witches hidden among the people. She had not stopped for half a year. Such a comfortable and peaceful life, it was probably the first time she had experienced it. Wasn't it the same for herself? Until she met Tilly, she lived a life that she didn't even dare to think about before. Accustomed to the relatively peaceful life in the palace, she ignored the significance of the town to the witches. In the eyes of the witches, the attraction of the town had always been unparalleled. They wanted to stay here and protect this territory, just like how she wanted to protect Tilly. If Roland Wimbledon could really resist the crazy god's punishment army as he had said, there was no doubt that this was a better choice than the fjords. Going to a completely unfamiliar land to establish a witch's country sounded very desirable, but in reality, no one could predict how many hardships they would have to go through. But if he couldn't resist, should the witches leave? Ash's mood suddenly calmed down. From another point of view, if Tilly couldn't establish a foothold in the fjords, she would probably choose to stand by her side and protect her until the last moment. As the person who gave her a home, she had no reason to leave first. This place is always under the threat of the church. If we can't resist the god's punishment army, the destruction of Border Town is only a matter of time. This competition was indeed not necessary, but she still decided to complete it, either as a warning or as a proof. What if they can resist? Maggie muttered. I hope so too, so I will help them verify this point, Ember said in a deep voice. Chapter 167. The venue of the competition was at the foot of the western wall of the town. In addition to Roland, the spectators included Iron Axe, Sir Pine, Brian, and all the members of the Witch Union. There was also a fat pigeon squatting on the watchtower. In order to avoid accidental bullets, everyone had to climb up the wall to watch. The two contestants, the Chief Knight Carter Lannis and the extraordinary Ashes, would fight one-on-one near the wall. Carter's attire was not the usual knight armor, but a close-fitting leather coat, with a custom-made holster around his waist, and a revolver on each side. There was also a dagger on the back of his waist, which could be used in an emergency. But Roland knew that if he had to use a dagger to fight with an extraordinary, it would be better to directly admit defeat. Ashes was still dressed as usual. A black robe covered her body, and her long black hair was tied into a ponytail, naturally hanging down her back. It seemed that she did not care that this would create unnecessary weaknesses for herself. The only difference was that the big sword, the cloth wrapped around it had been unwrapped, and the dark brown sword had almost no light. As Roland expected, the surface of the sword was uneven, not like a well-made weapon, and due to lack of maintenance, the place where the sword was cut had rust spots. The two walked into the field, and Carter constantly adjusted his position until he was more than 15 meters away from his opponent. At this distance, he had more than 80% confidence in hitting a fixed target. Taking out two pistols, he finally checked the bullets and the firing nozzles. Roland let Echo imitate and amplify his voice. The rules of the competition are very simple. Stop when you go too far, you are not allowed to hit the head, and you can admit defeat. As long as you don't die on the spot, Nana's healing ability can quickly restore you to your original state. Are there any questions? He waited for a moment, and seeing that the two had no objections, he then said, after hearing the bell, the competition begins. Ashes silently looked at her opponent. As an extraordinary, most of the time she followed her instinct to fight. After following Tilly, she also learned fighting skills from the court's master swordsman, but she always felt that these skills were of little help to her. The other party was the chief knight by the prince's side, but he did not carry the usual sword, shield, or spear on his back. He did not even wear armor. The weapon in his hand was extremely strange, but based on its shape, it was obvious that it was not a dagger-like melee weapon, so there was only one possibility left. It should be similar to a crossbow, a long-range weapon. Crossbows posed no threat to extraordinaires. This was something Ashes had learned from many battles. If it were a light crossbow, she could even catch a flying bolt with her bare hands. However, looking at the prince's confident expression, the weapon in the other party's hands was definitely not as simple as a crossbow. Her instincts were telling her that she had to get close to the knight as soon as possible and not wait for him to attack first. Therefore, before the start of the duel, Ashes inserted the front part of her sword into the ground. This posture seemed harmless, but it was the most effective way to deal with the archers. At this moment, a clear and melodious bell rang from the city walls. Ashes moved almost at the same time. She held the hilt of her sword with both hands and slammed it forward. Soil, grass, and gravel rose with the broad blade, splashing in the direction of the knight, forming a muddy smoke screen. The chief knight's reaction was also very fast. The weapon in his hand burst into flames and made a loud roar, but Ashes did not see anything. Either the other party did not load an arrow, or the arrow was so fast that she could not detect it. Compared to the first almost stupid mistake, she was more inclined to the latter. Under the cover of the muddy smoke screen, Ashes sprinted from the side. In the blink of an eye, the distance between the two was shortened to half, and at this time, the muddy smoke screen had not completely landed. Most people would subconsciously avoid the overwhelming amount of mud. As long as she could interrupt the other party's shooting, she would have won the battle. But Carter did not move from his position. He ignored the sand hitting his face and narrowed his eyes as he aimed his weapon at the approaching supernatural being. Then he pulled the trigger again. With a roar and a flash of light, Ashes reflexively took a step to the side. She still did not see the arrow that had been thrown at her. At the same time, the knight did not prepare to pull the bowstring or load an arrow. This new type of weapon could probably be fired continuously, but after missing 2 shots in a row, the outcome was already decided. The last 10 steps were also covered in the blink of an eye. She raised her sword vertically in front of her, stomped her feet on the ground, and charged at the knight like a bull. Such an impact would not kill him instantly, but it would be enough to knock him out. Even if he managed to hold on with his strong willpower, the shattered bones in his chest would make him completely lose the ability to fight. In this last breath, the opponent's third attack exploded in front of Ashes's eyes. She only felt a fierce shock on her sword, making a crisp buzzing sound, and then her right abdomen was numb, as if she had been grabbed by something. Almost at the same time, her whole body hit Carter's chest, directly knocking him out, drawing an arc in the air, and rolling to the ground. Only then did she have the time to check the injury on her waist. But just as she lowered her head, a strong sense of dizziness came to her brain. She staggered twice and almost fell to the ground. The power brought by the extraordinary magic seemed to be flowing away like water, and her limbs became extremely heavy. Ashes used her sword to support her body. The numbness of the wound had turned into a burning pain. Her waist seemed to be missing a part, and she could even see her bright red internal organs. Only by clenching her teeth could she not let herself fall. In Roland's eyes, the whole process of the match was only 4 or 5 seconds. He saw the extraordinary witch pick up the soil debris towards Carter and at the same time launch a charge from the other side, change direction once in the middle, and then hit the knight's body. Carter had shot a total of 3 bullets before he was hit, which was beyond Roland's expectation. In the face of the unusually fast Ashes, he was afraid that it would be difficult to even keep his eyes on the opponent's figure, but he was still able to aim and shoot, which fully proved that the title of Chief Knight was not undeserved. The first 2 missed shots were normal. In fact, if Ashes changed direction several times at this speed, Carter was afraid that he would not be able to hit his opponent. The key was the third shot. In the last 5 or 6 meters, Ashes blocked a straight line hit with her sword in front of her chest. If it was a crossbow, even if it was a heavy crossbow, at this time, at most the sword would be nailed, and it would have no effect on the extraordinary. But the 12mm caliber ammunition plus the steel bullet at this distance burst out with unparalleled power. At that time, Roland only saw the black debris splatter, and Ashes's side burst into a cloud of blood. When she stood still, the prince found that half of her waist had been lifted off, as if she had been bitten by a demonic beast. Her intestines had slipped out, hanging on her side. There was a bowl-shaped hole in the lower half of the sword, probably caused by the bullet hitting the iron sword and passing through it. The unstable bullet, together with the flying iron filings, rotated into her abdomen and opened up a huge wound. Even though she was seriously injured, she still did not faint, and insisted on standing on the field. The extraordinary witch's physical fitness was indeed terrifying. If it was the previous lead bullets or small caliber bullets, perhaps she could rely on her body to withstand it. Maggie rushed to Ashes's side, wanting to support her, but unfortunately, because of her short stature, she could only hold her legs, her face anxious. Nana had already rushed to treat Carter. Roland also quickly walked in front of Ashes, who was still holding on. She seemed to be waiting for this moment. Chapter 168. Go away. You filthy beggar. Someone pushed her hard, but she did not move an inch. Instead, she watched as the other person staggered 2 steps back. The arrogant look on his face immediately disappeared. After glaring at her fiercely, the other person left dejectedly. She was unmoved and continued to move into the crowd. Seeing this woman in tattered clothes, most people frowned and avoided her. Just like that, she slowly moved to the inner city gate of the Kingdom of Greycastle. There was already a sea of people here. Although the inner city did not have a traditional city wall or gate, people still erected a symbolic gate made of wooden strips and garlands. On both sides of the gate stood a row of warriors in full body armor. The exquisite armor reflected a dazzling luster under the sun. The hollow, eagle-shaped armor on their shoulders and the iris decorations on their chests, coupled with the handsome faces of the warriors, caused a group of rich girls to shout and scream. The warriors were all wearing red fur cloaks that dragged on the ground. From afar, it looked like a red wall. It was these handsome and mighty warriors that separated the crowd, leaving a path several feet wide behind the gate. Flags were fluttering on the side of the road. Many long golden flags hung from the top of the flagpoles, giving off a solemn feeling. There were many different patterns embroidered on the flags, most of which were towers and spears. She knew that this pattern represented the royal family of Greycastle, which was also the host of today's ceremony. Today was the coming-of-age ceremony of Princess Tilly Wimbledon. As early as a week ago, this matter had already spread like wildfire, and everyone in the city knew about it. Other than the local nobles of Greycastle, there were also many envoys from other kingdoms. They brought gifts and marriage contracts, hoping to win the favor of Princess Tilly. The church would also send a bishop to preside over this ceremony, which would be held in the Dawn Square in the center of the city. At that time, the royal family would give out meat porridge and thick soup, which was also the reason why so many people were attracted. But she did not come for food. Her target was the archbishop. Presumably, killing an archbishop in front of the eyes of the kingdom would definitely make the church lose face and greatly damage its prestige. The sweet taste of revenge always made her excited. She touched her chest. There was a short knife that she had stolen. Although it was of low quality, it was enough to kill a mortal. Suddenly, an earth-shattering cheer came from the crowd, interrupting her thoughts. She looked towards the inner city and saw the Royal Knight Regiment marching neatly towards her. The knight who was walking at the front was dressed in shiny clothes. Their red cloaks with golden edges fluttered behind them like clusters of leaping flames. Behind the knight was a carriage pulled by 4 horses. The walls of the carriage were engraved with the emblem of the Greycastle royal family. The wheels and frame of the carriage were gilded. A bright red triangular flag fluttered on the roof, and silk embroidered with golden threads hung from the 4 corners of the carriage. At a glance, the entire procession looked like a moving golden ocean. The crowd followed the convoy to Dawn Square. She was also mixed in the crowd and entered the periphery of the square. The inner circle had been isolated by the guards. Only the nobles could watch the ceremony up close. She estimated that it would only take a few seconds for her to rush over. As long as the archbishop stepped onto the square, he would not be able to escape from her. The children of the royal family jumped out of the carriage. Those who slowly walked onto the central platform were probably the 5 children of Wimbledon III. Among these people, she saw Princess Tilly Wimbledon. There was no doubt that the 5th princess was the main character of the day. Her eyes shone with a lively light, as transparent as a gem. Her neat side-parted bangs matched her refreshing gray long hair without any accessories. Her appearance was especially outstanding among her siblings. The patterns on her dress were not complicated, and it matched her temperament perfectly. And the most incredible thing was that she actually looked past the layers of the crowd and directly at herself. Then, she nodded slightly as if greeting her, and a smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. This was definitely not an illusion. In an instant, she had the same feeling. This feeling was incomparably intimate, as if they were friends who had known each other for many years. It was warm and sweet. It did not come from the recognition of blood, identity, or status, but from the resonance of magic. Unconsciously, she let go of the hilt of the knife and quietly watched the woman on the platform. After the ceremony, 2 guards found her and wanted to take her into the palace. As long as she had the intention to refuse, the guards could not stop her. But she did not ask anything. She followed the 2 into the inner city, and finally entered the magnificent palace from a side path. In a secret room of the palace, she stood in front of Princess Tilly. So that's how it is. What an unfortunate story. So that's how you ended up in Grey Castle. Don't worry, you don't have to wander anymore. You can stay with me. I will give you a good makeup and make sure that they will never recognize you again. I have inquired about it. The monastery was destroyed by fire and all the children are missing. The whole building is in ruins and ashes. Did you have a name before? In that case, I will call you Ashes. When Ashes opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Maggie's face. Maggie blinked and then hugged her. You finally woke up, Coo. She tried to move her fingers. There was no feeling of weakness or numbness as she expected, and there was no sharp pain in her waist. How long was I in a coma? An afternoon, Maggie said. Nana said that as long as you are cured, you can wake up at any time. But at this time your body will be very tired. Let it take its course and rest for a while. When you wake up, it will be much better for your energy to recover. Ashes patted Maggie's head and slowly sat up from the bed. She opened her clothes and found that her abdomen was intact. The huge wound was like a nightmare. When she woke up, it disappeared without a trace. How did she cure me? I guess you don't want to know, Maggie curled her lips. When she saw Ashes's determined eyes, she said, they collected your scattered, parts and filled them into your stomach. Then Nana used her magic to restore them to their original state. I heard from Lightning that the more parts she collected, the faster she can cure them. If a limb is completely lost, she can't make it grow back. Ashes felt goosebumps all over her body, then the dirt and grass that got stuck on it are also, after the wound heals, the dirt is discharged outside. Her ability seems to be able to distinguish what is useful and what is useless. She breathed a sigh of relief and rolled out of bed. She tried to feel the strength of her body. The result was just like Nana said. After waking up, she didn't feel weak. Instead, she felt stronger than ever. Ashes put on her black robe, looked at the sky outside the window, and walked toward the door. Where are you going? Maggie asked. Chapter 169. In the office, she once again saw Roland Wimbledon. He was immersed in writing something, probably dealing with government affairs. At this time, the sun was already setting in the west, the sky was dyed with a touch of gold. The afterglow passed through the glass window, leaving a long shadow in front of the table. Until the prince put down the quill, Ashes opened her mouth and said, I won. Indeed, you won. The other side simply nodded. Such a straightforward attitude surprised her a little. She thought that Roland would quibble, she didn't expect him to recognize the result. But I admit that you have the ability to fight against the God's punishment army. She said, the God's punishment army is not invulnerable. Their strength and body are similar to mine, but they lack the ability to think, which is why I can deal with 3 of them at the same time. According to the previous test, if the knight's opponents were the God's punishment army, I think they would only attack from the front. Therefore, the God's punishment army can't be sent alone like the army of judges. If I'm not wrong, the church needs to send someone to lead them in battle. Thank you, Roland smiled. This information is very important. What is the new weapon in the hands of the knight? A flintlock, he said. In the future, my soldiers will use this weapon. Even an unarmed farmer can defeat a well-trained army of judges with a flintlock. Ashes hesitated. Can you give me a flintlock? Only if you join the witch union, Roland said. After all, this kind of thing is still very rare at present. The other's refusal was expected. She exhaled. I must meet with Tilly as soon as possible. Tomorrow morning, I will leave Border Town. If you can't hold on, you can move to the fjords to take refuge. He nodded. You too, don't forget to tell this news to my dear sister. There is still a place for witches in the western region of Greycastle. Ashes was silent for a moment. I will think about it. Just as she was about to leave the office, the prince stopped her. Wait, I have a gift for you. It's behind the door. Gift? Startled, she turned around and saw a huge sword placed by the door. Because it was blocked by the door, she did not notice it when she came in. Your long sword can no longer be used, so I asked Anna to cut one for you. This isn't an inferior pig iron sword, it's made of pure steel. Indeed, its entire body was smooth and uniform, reflecting an orange-red metallic luster under the setting sun. She walked forward and gently stroked the sword. She could see that the thickness of the sword was very uniform, and there were traces of quenching on one side of the blade. There was no doubt that this was an excellent quality weapon. The only thing that puzzled Ashes was its shape. Compared to the standard double-edged sword, it only had a blade on one side. The other side was about the width of a little finger, without a sword tip, and its head was trapezoidal. Most peculiar of it all was the front of the sword. Besides the strange talisman markings inscribed on it, there was a round protrusion at the side of the blade that hadn't been sharpened, and it was painted gold, causing it to be extremely striking. Although she didn't want to admit that she liked it, she couldn't help but reach out and pick it up. Why does it look so strange? Because this isn't an ordinary weapon, Roland said with a smile. Its name is Ash's Emissary. Compared to your previous white greatsword, it can be regarded as a legendary item. Ashes decided not to delve into the inexplicable words that came out of his mouth. In that case, I'll accept it. In return, I'll give you a gift. Oh. What is it? The prince asked curiously. She didn't answer and left the room. Early the next morning, Roland opened the door and saw Nightingale sitting at the desk with a piece of dried fish in her mouth. They're gone. Both of them left? Yes, she answered languidly. She was on her way at first light, and Wendy went to see her off. Roland couldn't help but feel a little emotional. Wendy was full of concern for any of her sisters, not to mention the witch who had saved her from harm and indirectly helped her escape from the monastery. He had thought that Wendy would leave with Ashes, but he didn't expect that she would be the first to refuse the other's invitation. In the end, the witch union still had 12 people, which filled Roland with enthusiasm. Do you think they will really tell the news here to the witches on the other side of the sea? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. He leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. But when they encounter difficulties that they can't solve, they will always think of Border Town. Closing his eyes, Roland went through the memories of Prince Roland in his mind. Tilly didn't walk close to him, or rather, she kept a certain distance from everyone, even Wimbledon 3. In addition to her beautiful appearance and outstanding intelligence since childhood, there wasn't much information left in his mind about her. When Princess Tilly began to secretly shelter witches, and when she planned to go to the fjords, Roland didn't know anything. But no matter what, she was a natural ally that could be won over. After all, fighting against the church was their common goal at this stage. As for sending Theo to spread the news, it wasn't in vain. The awakening of witches was a random event, and it was impossible for Tilly to take away all the witches. Especially after the withdrawal of the organization, the newly awakened witches would be even more eager to find a place to live. Now that he knew the information about the God's Punishment Army, the next thing he needed to do was to expand the production of the double acid. More efficient gunpowder and explosives couldn't be separated from nitric acid and sulfuric acid. After the First Army changed to a revolving rifle, the rifled barrel with fixed bullets would greatly improve the shooting accuracy. Therefore, the significance of training became particularly important. In the era without the suppression of the barrage, a veteran with excellent archery was worth 10 recruits who randomly shot. At that time, the consumption of bullets would be an astonishing number. Moreover, the black powder would remain in the barrel, blocking the rifling and reducing the service life of the barrel. Only smokeless gunpowder could solve this problem. The early smokeless gunpowder was actually nitrocellulose, and later it was a mixture of nitrocellulose and nitrocellulose. Now, the amount of nitric acid used to soak the sealing collodion was quite insufficient, not to mention replacing all of it with collodion. After all, the laboratory method could only be used for small-scale production. If they wanted to meet the needs of the army, industrial production was necessary. Unfortunately, in the face of a completely unfamiliar chemical industry, Roland couldn't think of any good solutions. In addition to this, education couldn't be neglected. Not only the popularization of primary cultural knowledge, but also ideological transformation needed to be implemented as soon as possible. The natives had gone through the test of the months of demons, and with the propaganda of the First Army, they had a higher recognition of the witches, but the outsiders still accepted the ideas instilled by the church. Nowadays, the foreign population of Border Town was increasing rapidly, especially the serfs. They were still living in wooden sheds by the Redwater River, which could be regarded as the outer city of Border Town. But once they were promoted to free people, they would inevitably gradually move into the city. At that time, it would be too late to change their ideas. He had to come up with a kind of moisturizing and silent transformation method that could be easily accepted by the general public. After thinking for a while, he opened his eyes and suddenly found that Nightingale was watching him from the side. The moment their eyes met, she subconsciously turned her head away. "Ah, yes, I forgot to tell you one thing," the witch looked out of the window, pretending to be nonchalant. "Vendi asked me to pass on a message to you." "What?" Roland asked. Chapter 170. The sun slowly sank into the mountains, and night fell on the western region. The emissary delegation found an open space not far from the road and pitched their tents. Soon a bonfire was lit in the middle of the tent. The warriors took off their armor, stretched their tired bodies, and sat around the bonfire to boil water and cook porridge. Alicia came into the tent with a basin of hot water. "Lady Priestess, please wash your face." "Thank you." Mira nodded with a smile and dipped the towel into the water. "We'll arrive at Border Town tomorrow." "Thank you for your hard work." "Compared with dealing with demonic beasts, this is nothing," she replied. "But your riding skills impressed me. I thought the priestesses were not good at traveling." "Ha, I'm not a natural priestess. When I was a merchant, it was common to travel on horseback." Mira wiped the dust and sweat from her face with a towel and handed the basin to the female warrior. "You wash your face too. How are you feeling now? Are you feeling better?" "What?" Alicia was startled. "It's about the God's punishment army." The priestess smiled and shook her head. "Your mood is written all over your face. It's because of Abram's words, right?" She took the basin and did not answer. "We will encounter a lot of difficulties and challenges. If we can't overcome these thresholds, not only the church, but the whole world will suffer. In order to stop those terrible enemies, sometimes sacrifices are necessary," Mira said. "This is a dilemma, but don't forget the church's motto. Choose the lesser of two evils," Alicia whispered. "Yes, to measure whether the price is worth it depends on the purpose. The most important thing is that the conversion ceremony of the God's punishment army is completely voluntary. When Abram's brother decided to join the God's punishment army, he was ready to sacrifice himself for the church. This is a noble ideal. His name will also be engraved on the tablet of glory and be passed on with the glory of the church. Thank you for your guidance. Alicia put her right hand on her chest. I feel much better. The priestess is right. They are all dedicated to follow the glory of God. No matter what the result is, at least the God's punishment army followed their beliefs. Thinking of this, she felt the depression in her chest dissipate a lot. As long as I can help you, Mira chuckled. Let's go out and enjoy dinner. They should be ready by now. To be honest, I've been eating porridge so much that my tongue can't even taste it. Fortunately, today is the last day, Alicia said with a smile. Tomorrow, we should be able to enjoy the Lord's personal hospitality and a sumptuous dinner. After the tasteless dinner, the presiding judge selected the night watchers for the night. The judgment warriors who were not assigned any tasks went into their tents and slept early. Alicia was no exception. She and the priest returned to the tent, extinguished the oil lamp, and covered themselves with bedding. After an unknown amount of time, when she was in a daze, she suddenly heard a soft muffled sound, as if something had fallen to the ground. Soon, the second sound rang out. This time, she also heard the sound of the armor hitting the ground. It was not obvious, but it was definitely not an illusion. Her eyes flew open. Alicia quickly grabbed the two-handed sword beside her and slowly moved to the side of the tent. When she was about to lift the corner of the tent to see what was going on, she heard the roar of the presiding judge. Enemy attack! Warriors, attack! The roar broke the silence of the night, and the camp instantly boiled up. Then there was a loud noise. The presiding judge's voice stopped abruptly. Without hesitation, she rolled out of the tent and saw that the presiding judge's sword had been split in half. No. Not only his sword, but the presiding judge himself had also been split in half. Blood spurted into the sky. Under the light of the bonfire, he knelt down weakly, his body split in two, and slowly fell at the feet of a woman. This woman with a strange giant sword was the attacker. Her whole body was covered in a black robe, and her face was covered by a hood. Under the shadow of the brim of the hood, Alicia could only see a pair of golden pupils shining. Two more members of the Judgment Army rushed forward, but in front of that terrifying weapon, their resistance was futile. The enemy killed a warrior with a single slash, and the man and the sword were cut in half. The loud noise came from the moment the weapons collided. Sparks and debris flew everywhere, followed by the sound of the blade rubbing against the flesh and bones. This nightmarish sound almost froze the female warrior's blood. It's a witch! Someone exclaimed. She was the only enemy. She dared to attack the Judgment Army with her own strength, except for the fallen who had obtained the power of the devil, there was no other possibility. Take the priest away. A calm voice suddenly came into Alicia's ear. She turned her head and saw that it was Abrams. You actually want me to abandon my companions and leave? Alicia stared at him with wide eyes. Otherwise, you will only die here for no reason, don't you understand? He frowned and growled, the enemy is not afraid of the God's stone of retaliation, only an extraordinary has this ability. I will try my best to stop her, you take the priest and go in the direction of Longsong stronghold. Remember to take the main road, and immediately call for help if you encounter a caravan camping. With that, he rushed towards the enemy with his sword. Extraordinary, she gasped. According to legend, only the God's punishment army could fight against them, so if they encountered an extraordinary, they should immediately ask for help from the local church. Alicia knew that he was right, staying here would only make their sacrifice in vain. 5 of her teammates had already fallen on the field, so the remaining Judgment Warriors changed their strategy and used the tents and terrain to fight, which could buy them a little more time. But she knew that in front of an extraordinary who was far stronger and faster than them, it was only a matter of time before they were destroyed. She gritted her teeth and rushed into the tent, pulling Mira, who had already put on her shoes and was waiting for the news, and ran to the place where the horses were tied. What happened? The priest asked in a deep voice. An extraordinary attacked the camp. I must take you away. She turned over and mounted the horse. Please hurry. However, it was impossible to see the road clearly at night, so if they ran wildly on the bumpy road, it was easy to trip and break the horse's leg. If they jogged, they would not be able to run far before the enemy caught up with them. Alicia decided to let the horses run along the road, while she and the priest sneaked into the woods on the side of the road. In the absence of light, it would not be easy to find them. The sound of weapons clashing gradually faded away. She took Myra's hand, relying on the dim moonlight to distinguish the surrounding environment, and continued to go deeper in the direction away from the road. Maybe they would encounter beasts or poisonous snakes, but it was better than encountering witches. It wasn't until the two of them arrived near the impassable mountain range that Alicia felt slightly relieved. The other side didn't seem to be chasing after them. Apart from the annoying bird cries above their heads, the surroundings were completely silent. What should we do next? Mira asked. Even at this time, she still did not appear to be too flustered. This calmness made Alicia admire her. My lady, we can find a leeward place here, temporarily spend the night, and wait until dawn to return to Longsong's stronghold to seek support. Don't you want to go to border town to avoid danger? It will take at least 1 day and 1 night to go back from here. No need, Alicia shook her head. The extraordinary came too coincidentally. I suspect that the Lord has already colluded with the witches. It is too dangerous to go to border town now. What you said also makes sense. Alicia suddenly froze, her eyes looking straight behind the female warrior. Chapter 171. Devil. Alicia unsheathed her two-handed sword and stood in front of Mira. Devil? Her tone was cold and almost emotionless. Then what about you who send orphans and abandoned babies to the monastery to be raised and choose witches from them? What nonsense are you talking about? The female warrior scolded. The church takes them in out of God's mercy. If there is no monastery, how many of them can live to adulthood? However, the pervasive devil always corrupts the weak-willed among them, leading a very small number of people astray. Once someone is found to have degenerated into a witch, the church will immediately deal with them. You have completely reversed the cause and effect. Hearing the word deal with, the witch's golden eyes instantly dimmed a lot. She raised her giant sword with one hand. I don't have much interest in persuading a dead person, so be it. Before her voice fell, the owl spread its wings and flew up. Her figure had already rushed in front of her. Alicia deeply remembered the tragic scene of her teammate who had been split in half with his sword. Instead of retreating, she pounced towards the lower right side of the extraordinary. In the swordsmanship training class, the instructor had more than once mentioned that the lower right side was the most difficult position to take care of, because of the limitation of the sword-holding posture. If you want to change the direction of the blade, you need to spend an extra half a breath of time. Like a leopard, Alicia pounced to avoid the witch's direct slash. When she passed the witch's side, she held her two-handed sword horizontally, trying to counterattack. But the extraordinary's reaction was amazingly fast. With a light jump, she easily avoided this horizontal sweep, at the same time turning around to lift the giant sword. Until this time, Alicia had not even completely landed. Everything happened in a flash. Half of her calf flew into the sky along with blood. A tearing pain came from the lower part of her body, almost making her lose consciousness. Relying on her instinct to tightly clench her teeth, the female warrior did not cry out on the spot. The gap was too big. She now understood how powerful Abrams was, who was able to fight with the extraordinary for more than 10 swords, giving her the opportunity to escape. Alicia struggled to turn over, just in time to see Mira take out a crossbow from her backpack, raise her hand and aim at the extraordinary witch who was paying attention to her. This was her last chance. She realized that she might be able to attract his attention. Just as the female warrior was about to say something, the greatsword swept past her like a whirlwind. She felt her throat tighten, and then the world turned upside down. No, perhaps she was flying. She saw her body weakly kneeling down. At the same time, she saw an owl swooping towards Mira, but in midair, it transformed into a girl and viciously smashed into the priest's body. Her vision quickly blurred, and she finally fell to the ground, falling into endless darkness. This damned rock, Ku. Maggie touched the bump on her head and complained, "You were too careless. If it wasn't for me, you would have been shot by that arrow." "Don't worry, I've noticed it. I just want to finish this quickly." Ashes quickly dug a shallow pit with her sword, dragged the two of them into the pit, and covered them with soil. Both the god's stone of retaliation and the golden dragon were now in her bag, so she had enough money to travel to the port of Clearwater. She also found a letter on the body of the woman wearing the priest's robe. Glancing over it, she found that if the Lord of the Western Territory, Roland Wimbledon, did not collude with witches, she would ask him to buy baby girls and orphans. Before this, the other party in this transaction was the Duke of Ryan. As long as they were underage women, they could pay the market price, or they could use pills to offset the price. After reading the letter, Ashes sneered, put the letter on the torch and lit it, directly burning it. "Let's go, we still have a pile of bodies to bury." Ku. Maggie turned back into an owl, taking Ashes with her to the first place of attack. Digging, transporting, burying people. Maggie couldn't help much with these physical tasks. Moreover, the smell of blood and broken limbs made her a little dizzy, so she could only land on a branch and watch Ashes busy herself. "Why are you doing this? If the church finds out, wouldn't it be terrible? When they find out that the emissary group has disappeared, it will be 2 or 3 months later," Ashes said while shoveling the soil. "Generally, when the church sends out an emissary group to investigate the witches, if the Lord cooperates, it will last for more than a month, plus the time it takes for them to return, it will be almost 2 or 3 months. But His Royal Highness will certainly not cooperate with them. Ku. You'd better turn back into your human form and talk to me again." Ashes sighed. "If the Lord allows the emissary group to enter Border Town, the witches of the Witch Cooperation Association will inevitably be exposed. The emissary group doesn't need to ask the prince himself, they only need to catch the people and interrogate them. Roland can either sell out the witches and lie that all of this has nothing to do with him, or he can only catch them all. If the other side is prepared in advance, as long as one of them escapes, Hermes will soon receive the news. You can also see that they are also carrying carrier pigeons. Pigeons can't see at night, so I have already caught them." Maggie patted her bulging waist bag. "When they are cooked tomorrow, we will each have one." Ashes secretly shook her head. She had never seen her catch a bird to eat before. She had only been in Border Town for a few days, but she unexpectedly had a strong interest in roasted bird meat. If the church decides to send out the army, he will only have about a month left. But now, as long as his luck isn't too bad, he can at least have 3 more months. "So, this is my gift to him, it is also my revenge against the church." "So that's how it is, as expected of Sister Ashes," Maggie praised. There was one more point that Ashes didn't say. In this way, it was equivalent to her making the decision for the prince. When the church found out that they had lost contact with the emissary group, they would certainly blame it on Roland Wimbledon. At that time, even if he wanted to sell out the witches, he wouldn't have the opportunity. When everything was ready, the sky was gradually turning bright. "So, we will part ways here," Ashes said. Maggie was stunned. "What?" She touched the other's small head and squatted down. "You like Border Town very much, don't you? With Lightning and Vendy, you will certainly be very happy here. But..." The other lowered her head, looking hesitant. "I also like you and Lady Tilly. I don't want you to stay here all the time." Ashes smiled. "Roland Wimbledon and Tilly are different. After all, he is an ordinary nobleman. It is difficult to guarantee that he will always stand on the side of the witches. This is also the task I want to give you. Once a month you will fly back and tell us what happened in Border Town, at the same time bring our news back to the witches of the Witch Cooperation Association. In this way, the two sides can also establish contact. If the town is in danger, you can also help them escape from Grey Castle and go to the fjords. Is that so?" Maggie blinked. "That's it," she nodded. "I believe you can do it." Chapter 172. That's all for today. Class dismissed. Goodbye, teacher. The little girls said in unison. Irene closed her textbook and watched the children walk out of the classroom. This place originally belonged to a noble family, but after the months of demons, it was expropriated by the Lord, and now it had been transformed into a college. The partitions of the small rooms downstairs and upstairs were connected into several larger rooms, which could accommodate 4 to 6 groups of apprentices at the same time. According to the division in the textbook, they were called classes. During the day, most of the students were children, and at night, it was adults. She thought that it would take a long time for her application to be a teacher to reach the city hall, but she didn't expect that after Philin reported the matter, the next day she got the approval. Then she went to the city hall to register her identity, receive her teaching materials, and get a class list. She was responsible for teaching the children of the townspeople. In order to make this group of troublemakers listen to her class, she spent a lot of effort. There was also a chapter in the textbook on how to maintain classroom discipline, which was an eye-opener for her. In addition to the traditional verbal criticism and cane corporal punishment, there was also the evaluation of excellence, the division of groups, the establishment of a team leader and class monitor, and so on. The person who wrote this textbook must be an elder who had studied teaching for many years, so he could consider everything so well. Walking out of the college, Irene saw the knight, Philin Schilt, waiting for her at the gate. He was no longer wearing a shining armor, holding a shield and a sword embroidered with a lion emblem, but he was still very handsome. A simple leather coat set off his tall and straight figure, coupled with his well-defined facial features. Even if he was empty-handed, he was still the light of dawn in her memory. After giving him a hug, Irene noticed that Philin's expression was a little strange. "What's wrong?" she asked. He hesitated. "His Royal Highness invited us to the palace in the afternoon to enjoy tea." Irene was startled. "We?" She immediately guessed what he was worried about. She patted his back and shook her head. "His Royal Highness has never seen me before. How could he be like the Duke? Besides, don't I still have you?" Philin nodded. "This time, I'll protect you." In the afternoon, Irene dressed herself up simply and chose a decent dress before heading to the Lord's castle with her husband. He was ushered into the guest hall by the guard. Not long after, a gray-haired man appeared at the entrance. Without a doubt, he was the Lord of the Western region, His Highness Roland Wimbledon. He was accompanied by a lady who was about 30 years old and had a calm and capable posture. From her charming facial features, one could tell that she must have been an outstanding beauty when she was young. The two of them hurriedly got up and bowed. "Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Schilt." Roland sat down at the head of the table. "The dishes on the table are all palace delicacies. Feel free to enjoy them. Thank you for your invitation. It's my honor to come here and enjoy the refreshments." Philin replied in accordance with aristocratic etiquette. "This lady is called Scroll. She's also the person in charge of the City Hall's education department. I think you should have already met her." "Indeed." He nodded to Scroll to show his respect. "I haven't thanked you yet. Without your permission, Irene wouldn't have become a teacher so quickly." So it was she who had helped me, Irene thought, and gave her a grateful smile. After chatting for a while, Philin tentatively asked, "I don't know why your Royal Highness called us here." "It's related to education." Roland paused and looked at Irene. "I heard that you used to work in the Longsong Stronghold Theater. Are you an actor?" "Ah." Irene didn't expect that His Royal Highness would ask her this question. "I've only performed once. It's like this. I plan to put on a play in the town square every weekend," the prince said directly. "As for the script, the scriptwriter, and the conductor, I'm only missing performers. You don't have many classes, but you have experience in theater. I want you to star in this play. Of course, there will be extra pay. I don't know if you're willing." Irene looked at His Royal Highness in disbelief. After confirming that the other side wasn't joking, she excitedly nodded and said, "Your Royal Highness, I'm willing." Standing on the stage and performing had always been her wish. After leaving the Longsong Theatre, she knew that she might never have the opportunity to perform in a play again. In front of Philin, she didn't show any regret. She just hid her wish in the bottom of her heart. She didn't expect that there would be a day when she would return to the stage. These plays are performed for the masses, so the requirements aren't high. As long as the story is clearly told, it's fine. Do you have any friends in Longsong Stronghold who have a certain understanding of theater, but don't have the opportunity to perform on the stage? If you do, you can write a letter to them saying that in Border Town, there are performances every weekend, and the salary is the same as in the Longsong Stronghold Theater. Even they can do it. I know a lot of them. Irene was overjoyed. I'll write to them when I go back. If they can get the opportunity to perform, I think they will be very happy to come to Border Town. Very good. Roland handed over 3 books. This is the script, there are numbers on it. Your performance will start with the first story. The content is adapted from Scroll, very close to the lives of ordinary people. You can take it back and read it carefully. If there is anything you don't understand, you can ask Scroll. Yes, Your Royal Highness. Thank you. Irene bowed. Is this okay? Scroll asked, those stories are obviously what you came up with. It doesn't matter, in their eyes, the prince can't write such vulgar things. Roland stretched, and without your final revision, the script can't be completed in a short time. I don't think the story is vulgar at all, she shook her head, although I don't know why you know so clearly, those are the things that happen to the people, touching and thought-provoking, the performance will certainly be very popular. Of course it will be very popular, Roland thought. The first 2 plays were adapted from Cinderella and The Rooster Crows in the Middle of the Night, and had been tested by the people for a long time. The former described the touching love between the common people and the royal family, and the latter was the struggle of the people at the bottom against the unscrupulous landlords. Of course, they had been localized adaptations, such as the witch in Cinderella became a witch, and the landlord in The Rooster Crows in the Middle of the Night became a fierce little aristocrat. Roland intended to release the 3rd work, The Witch Diaries, after the first 2 plays had a profound impact, which was also his real purpose. This was a play completely conceived by him, telling the story of 3 children who became witches, but each went on a completely different path. He did not directly mention the church, but focused on the fate of these 3 people. 1 child was abandoned by her parents, 1 was used as a tool, and the last lucky child's parents still loved her deeply, and in order to protect her, they gave up their lives. In the end, the 3 people came together by chance, defeated the enemies who wanted to kill them, and obtained their own happiness like ordinary people. Chapter 173. When they returned home, Philin shook his head helplessly. Can't you think about it for a few more days before you answer His Highness? When he saw his wife come back, she was almost jumping up and down. The last time he saw her so happy was probably at the wedding. No, Irene stuck out her tongue, I can't sleep even if I'm late for a day. Yes, she loved the theater so much that when she was in the Longsong Stronghold Theater, she often practiced until midnight, and often rehearsed her lines with herself. If it weren't for the Duke, she would have already changed from the flower of the theater to the star of the theater. Thinking of this, he gently hugged his wife from behind. I'm sorry. Irene patted his head. It's not your fault, at that time you were transferred to another city, there was no way to stop him. She smiled gently. If you want to apologize, go cook, I want to read the script first. Okay, I'll cook. Philin kissed her earlobe, meat porridge and fried eggs, plus a roast sausage to celebrate. Many of the furnishings of the new residence were different from the ones he was familiar with in the past, such as the cooking stove. In Longsong Stronghold, whether it was a noble or a commoner, they would always have an open hearth in the center of the main living room, unlike the new residence, which had a separate room for the stove. The stove was surrounded on 3 sides, and the back was directly connected to the chimney. There was a horizontal baffle at the entrance, which could be closed when not in use, to prevent the smoke of the residents downstairs from coming out of the stove. Philin could easily think of the advantages of such a design. After closing the door, the living room could not be affected by cooking fumes and smells, and in summer it could also effectively reduce the indoor temperature. He filled the stove with firewood and sawdust, raised the flame, and began to concentrate on cooking tonight's dishes. After dinner, Irene continued to immerse herself in the script. Almost to the end of the candle, she put down the third book, and took a long breath. "How is it?" Philin couldn't help but be curious. What kind of script could make her spend so long to read? It must be known that when she was in the theater, she could read more than a dozen such thick books in half a day. "It's really hard to describe," Irene exclaimed. "Every book is full of new ideas. I've never read a story like this before." In Cinderella, the prince did not fall in love with a princess, but a beautiful commoner girl. This was not surprising, but he insisted on marrying a commoner as his wife. I even wondered, when His Royal Highness read this story, would he not be dissatisfied with its absurd and bizarre contents? Aside from that, the whole story was exciting, especially when the prince found Cinderella again and put on the crystal shoe for her. I couldn't help but want to applaud them. The Rooster Crows at Midnight is also very interesting. Compared to Cinderella, it's much simpler. I think the story can be explained in about 2 or 3 scenes. Moreover, the part where the serfs plucked up their courage to fight against the nobles is very wonderful. After a long period of foreshadowing, the serfs' emotional changes from trying to endure to the point where they could no longer bear it. The feeling of eruption when they finally decided to resist is very satisfying. The serfs fought against the nobles. Philin frowned. This was something that the nobles absolutely could not tolerate. If the serfs in the Schilt manor dared to use hoes and shovels to fight against the head of the family, I'm afraid that the next day my father would erect their heads at the entrance of the manor. Does His Royal Highness really want you to perform this kind of play? That's because you haven't read the script. Irene gave him a blank look. After reading it, you will have the same feeling as me. Standing up and resisting was not something they could do. The small nobles simply bullied them too much. In the face of a life-threatening situation, they still just put the nobles in a cloth bag and beat them up. I think they already restrained themselves very much. Later, the nobles wanted to execute all the serfs, but a witch who was passing by saved them. She turned into the image of a well-known local nobleman and stopped the bad guys, then went to the lord's castle to plead for the serfs. After a debate, the lord made a wise and benevolent decision. He bought the serfs and promoted them to free people. I bet that by the time the play reaches this point, the audience will be cheering. But the nobles will certainly protest, Philin disapprovingly thought, and then the theater will come under pressure from the nobles, and finally the crew will be disbanded. Wait a minute, he suddenly realized that in addition to Viscount Tigu and His Royal Highness, there are no other nobles living in Border Town, and the latter is also the founder of the crew. In other words, the plays that His Royal Highness asked them to perform were really only for the general public to watch? But they can't even earn a few copper royals from their hands. According to the standard of the Longsong Stronghold Theatre, this is simply a loss. Did His Royal Highness just want to entertain himself? But my dear, Irene didn't notice the change in his expression, although the first 2 plays are wonderful enough, but compared to the third book, The Witch Diary, they are nothing. I bet that even if it was in a big city like Redwater City or King City, the theater would immediately pick out a crew, specially rehearse and publicize the story in advance. I have to say, Scroll is really a genius screenwriter. Whether it is the content of the story or the narrative technique, it is far better than any other play today. Are you sure? Philin was amused by her serious look. Even in Longsong Stronghold, I often hear the name of Mr. Cajun Fells. His To the Rose, and The Chronicles of a Prince's Search for Love, are both highly acclaimed works, not only in King's City, but also in other kingdoms. I heard that there are also troops from other kingdoms who come to watch and learn from it. Do you think it is better than these classic plays? Of course, you are doubting my judgment, my dear. She roughly explained the content of the play. Not to mention the plot, it is the first time I have seen such a novel narrative technique. Compared with the previous plays, which are like listening to a third person telling the story, this one firmly focuses on the three witches, and their actions have a profound impact on each other, but they themselves are unaware of it. But near the middle of the story, all the seemingly unrelated clues come together, and the three witches become an inseparable whole. I have to say, this kind of parallel development of the story will certainly cause a sensation, of course, not in Border Town. I even doubt how many people will be able to see this level. She excitedly found a pen and paper and buried herself in writing a letter. No, I have to quickly call all the theater partners over, I really want to see their surprised faces. However, Philin stepped forward and held her hand. Wait, Irene, don't you think the content of the story is too contrary to common sense? After listening to his wife's narration, he also felt that the whole story was exciting, showing the good and evil of human nature. However, the description of the witches was completely opposite to what the church said, and it was too detailed. For example, the third lucky witch, because of the love of her family, was able to release her ability without restraint, but eventually found that the demonic bite was just a lie. Apart from being able to control magic, witches were no different from ordinary people. They could also laugh, cry, and grieve when their loved ones passed away. Isn't Prince Roland afraid that the church will come to find him if the news gets out? Contrary to common sense. No. Philin, before they became witches, they were all ordinary people, right? Well, that's right. What about me? Irene widened her eyes and said, if I become a witch, will you think I'm evil? No, of course not, Philin quickly said, you will always be the kind girl I know. Then what if we have a daughter, and she becomes a witch? Of course, that's even more impossible. He suddenly closed his mouth. In his heart he already understood what his wife meant. Judging witches from an outsider's point of view was completely different from judging one's loved ones as evil. That's right, Irene nodded with satisfaction. If we really have a witch, I will be like the father of the third witch in the story, I will take good care of her. The knight knelt down on one knee and made a vow of loyalty. This is a qualified answer, she put down the quill and chuckled. I think we can try it now. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.